Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
Adriana was once again admiring the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. She had her brushes in her hands and her easel next to her. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her occupation. Drawing? Love. From her earliest childhood, she always tried to transfer to paper everything she liked, or vice versa, all her thoughts and experiences, and she was also very fond of nature. No detail escapes her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable precision. Adriana's mother could always understand what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than any words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left the world so early, hurt her heart. Adriana had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the epitome of femininity and beauty. After all, there was simply no other way to think of her. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Adriana idolized her mother, as well as her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Adriana's mom madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mom died suddenly and quickly. She just didn't wake up one day. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone. It was her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Adriana still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl had crammed herself into a closet out of fear and didn't come out of there until the evening. The realization that in her life will never be a mother again came much later, when she and her father had to adjust their lives together. The relationship with her father was much more complicated, though Adriana respected and obeyed him immensely. But her father was harsh, categorical, and demanding. He did not approve of his daughter's choice of profession, so he forced her to leave art school in high school and to prepare for a serious university in a useful, as he said, specialty. Adriana realized that her father did it out of good intentions. After all, he repeatedly said that he would leave all his fortune to her, and she, in turn, should properly dispose of it. But the girl was far away from all this, thinking and dreaming of something else entirely. Of course, she was accustomed to the comfortable conditions in which she lived, but all this seemed to her secondary, not requiring to sacrifice her dreams. The sunset today was unusual, crimson, maroon from the brilliance of the sun that had rolled over the horizon, as if it were throwing splashes, illuminating everything around it. At such moments, Adriana tried with bated breath to transfer to canvas the beauty before her. Looking at the screen of her phone, the girl realized her father would be back soon, and he always demanded that his daughter be home at that time, waiting for his return. And despite the fact that Adriana was already old enough, her father tried to control her every move. Throwing a sad glance at the evening surface of the lake, she hurriedly gathered her things and moved towards home. Together with her father, they lived in an elite settlement within the city. Their house was quite large and well-maintained, and there were even a few servants on staff. The gardener took care of the grounds, the maids did the cleaning, and the cook worked in the kitchen. They also had an elderly woman who was the oldest of the servants and had the position of steward. Long ago, she had been Adriana's nanny, and when the girl grew up, the owners could not part with this kind woman. And since she was quite lonely, she herself was happy to stay in this family. She loved the girl very much. Adriana also loved Christina very much, and after her mother's death, she began to treat her especially reverently. And today, Christina was the first to meet the girl after the walk. "Well, where are you getting to?" "Soon after all father will be back," grumbled she. "The sunset fascinated me so much that I could hardly tear myself away." Adriana smiled dreamily. "Oh, my dreamer." The woman hugged the girl affectionately. "Now get dressed and come down for dinner," she added. After taking a shower and tidying up, Adriana went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" asked her father as if Adriana had never done so before. "Of course, Daddy," the girl replied affectionately and followed her father. Christina was also present at dinner as a real member of the family, despite her strictness. James respected the woman immensely. "Your birthday is coming up." Father spoke. "I've prepared a surprise for you," he said mysteriously. "What kind of surprise?" Adriana tensed. It always alarmed her when her father spoke in riddles, not to rush things. "The birthday is still 2 months away. You'll find out everything a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. It meant that the conversation was over, and no one present tried not to break the silence. It annoyed him when the table was noisy. Adriana looked sadly at her mother's portrait, which stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mom was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. Yes, and the father was much softer, being under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he'd been unbearable. Deep down, Adriana was even afraid of him. From Christina, she learned that her father had serious problems with business. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Where would they come from, though? After all, her father controlled her every move. Immersed in unhappy thoughts, the girl shuddered when she heard the phone ringing. "My girl, hello, how are you?" called favorite aunt, Mom's sister. "Everything is fine," sadly answered Adriana, but having grasped, cheerfully asked, "How are you? I haven't seen you for 1,000 years. I missed you very much." Adriana tried to hide the excitement caused by this call. Memories of her mother were again troubling her soul. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Nancy in the village, and the time spent there had been one of the happiest memories of her childhood. "So that's actually why I'm calling." Aunt Nancy's voice was still cheerful and cheerful. "In short, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say it's going to be hot. We'll go swimming with you to the river." Well, how about it? The question hung in the air, and though Adriana already saw herself in the village, it would be rash to give an answer without consulting her father. "Aunt Nancy, I have a session to attend. Only after that I might be able to come, and my father must be consulted." Adriana heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry. I'll do my best. I'm very eager to tell you." She tried to cheer up her aunt. They agreed that Adriana would call next week and said goodbye. The village. Adriana had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work a lot harder than the city folk, and the labor was mostly physical, but they saw so much beauty every day. A wide river full of all kinds of fish, a huge deciduous forest with its gifts, fields surrounding the village from almost all sides, a holy spring, beating from under the ground, giving people crystal clear water. And this was by no means a complete list of things Adriana could bring. Several days had passed since her aunt's call, and thoughts of a possible trip to the village did not leave Adriana for a moment. Perhaps she wanted to visit once more the place where she had been so happy. After all, For the last few years, she had felt unwanted by anyone. Her father had been preoccupied solely with his career, as if trying to escape his grief at work. Of course, Aunt Nancy often called, especially after the death of her sister, tried to support morally favorite niece, although she herself experienced the loss strongly. But all this was not the same. You needed someone close by to feel warm and know that someone needed you. Was the session coming to an end? Approaching the moment of the imminent conversation with her father, berating herself for being afraid of her own father, Adriana rehearsed the upcoming speech. She had hardly seen him lately, as he literally slept at work. But one day she managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his office when Adriana knocked timidly on the door. "May I? I wanted to talk to you." Adriana asked shyly, closing the door. "Yes, come in," her father answered absent-mindedly. He kept his eyes on the laptop, wiping the sweat from his forehead, the 3-day stubble and the wrinkled shirt alerting Adriana. Her father had always been a great pedant about everything, and his appearance had always been impeccable. But not today. Sitting down in the large leather chair across from her father, Adriana decided to start the conversation. "Aunt Nancy called me yesterday." Quietly, the girl began the conversation. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How is she doing?" James answered, still staring at the monitor. "She's doing fine, but she's offered me something and I'd like to discuss it with you." Adriana exhaled. "Discuss?" Her father raised his eyebrows in surprise. Finally, distracted. "Okay, I'm listening." "Aunt Nancy has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd really like that." "Sure, if you don't mind." Adriana asked, lowering her voice. "Good. Go and have fun at the same time. On one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're having a big party." Adriana couldn't believe her happiness. She didn't think her father would even approve of the idea. "Thank you, Dad." Adriana stood up and walked over to her father and hugged him tightly. James kissed her on the top of her head and stroked her head affectionately, just as he had done when she was a child. Adriana was touched, especially when she noticed the tears in her father's eyes. "That's it, go daughter. I have work to do." Abruptly, he said, going back to work again. Adriana didn't bother to interrupt. All the more, what she had come here for had been accomplished. But in her heart, she felt inexplicable, wistful, and sad. That evening she called her aunt, informing her of her imminent arrival, which caused a storm of positive emotions on her part. A few days later she packed her things, going to the train, the ticket for which she had bought in advance. Already sitting on the train, she was anticipating how she would spend her vacation. Everything was new to her, starting with traveling on her own. In fact, despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere, so when she fell asleep to the clatter of the wheels, the smile never left her face. Early in the morning, standing on the almost deserted platform, Adriana breathed in the fresh air, the air that took her back to her childhood. "Adriana? God, how long has it been since we've seen each other?" Her aunt threw herself on her neck, and when the hottest moments of the first meeting had passed, she looked at her niece from head to foot. "How beautiful you are! I can't believe it." The aunt whistled, and they both laughed. Grabbing half of Adriana's things, Aunt Nancy strode towards the motorcycle with the cradle where her neighbor was waiting for them. Adriana smiled as they rode through a large field, planted with nothing. Such an expanse for painting she hadn't seen in a long time. A multitude of wildflowers were stacked in whimsical islands, forcing her imagination to plan their arrangement on the canvas. A warm breeze blew her hair out of its braid, and despite the violent shaking, Adriana was happy. "I've made you a bed. It's much cooler here. It's very stuffy in the house now," Auntie commanded. After unpacking her things, Adriana went out onto the porch and looked at the familiar, but almost forgotten outlines of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since she had been here with her mother. "Let's go to lunch, sweetheart." Putting a hand on her shoulder, Aunt Nancy spoke. Adriana brushed away a sudden tear and followed her. They were to dine in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father never ate in the garden, even though it was beautiful, preferring to do so only at home. And here, dining al fresco seemed so obvious that Adriana ate even more than usual. If it goes on. Waking up, barely the sun showed from behind the horizon. The girl took her easel and went out to the backyard, where she had a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, Adriana hurried to help her aunt at breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. The freedom of movement made her wildly excited, and walking through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Are you settling in?" Aunt Nancy asked. "Yes, a little. The nature here, of course, is crazy." Adriana shared her impressions. Although Auntie saw everything perfectly well, those bright and cheerful eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Adriana was stiff and as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This is not a city. It's a real place to live," the woman replied thoughtfully. They had a quick snack, some of the food they had brought with them, and put it in the basket. They grabbed their beach gear and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor before the girls' eyes was astounding. The boundless lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. Perhaps the landscape is not inferior to foreign resorts. Adriana smiled. "You should have brought an easel. You'll have time, believe me, and today let's go sunbathing and swimming." Aunt Nancy nodded towards the blanket she had spread out. Adriana took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimsuit. She had taken care of the purchase of this article of clothing in advance, knowing that she would definitely be swimming in the local body of water. Suddenly, the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning around, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Adriana uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Nancy and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working, so she glanced around at the group. Suddenly, one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Adriana looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying in the hot sun for a while, Adriana and her aunt decided to take a dip. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where that very company was resting. But this guy Adriana did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl who was with him, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to Auntie's story, the reason for this was because of the underground springs flowing directly into the lake. Adriana and Aunt Nancy came home in the late afternoon and started cooking dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a wonderful time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "There was no suitable company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with sadness, but time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And though fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and I haven't felt as good as I do today in a very long time." Aunt Nancy brushed away her tears. Adriana rushed to comfort her. "Aunt Nancy, Why don't you move in with us? We have a big house, and Daddy, I think, will not mind," suggested the girl. "No, honey, I belong here. It's where I belong, and it's where I'll end up. But I want you not to forget this place. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Adriana did not answer anything. She pressed Aunt Nancy against her chest and stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands came out. After they had cried enough, they went back to the houses. It was getting dark, but Adriana didn't want to go to bed. She went out onto the veranda and brought a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she looked up at the stars and dreamed. Hearing the creak of the wicket door opening, the girl shuddered. On the path directly to her stepped the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. I'm sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice. I didn't know where or when I could see you again." The guide looked her straight in the eyes and smiled. "This is for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Adriana accepted them and gave the young man her radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you have to introduce yourself." The girl answered not bravely, trying to hide her excitement. "Ethan," the young man answered immediately. "And you, Adriana, are you? How do you know?" She was surprised. "I had to find out." The boy smiled. Adriana noticed a shadow in the window of the dark room and realized that it was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Would your girlfriend be unhappy that you came here?" she decided to ask Adriana. It was a question that had been on her mind ever since she had seen them hugging on the beach. "I don't have a girlfriend. Lisa is just a friend. We rent a house near you for the second summer in a row. There are 5 of us, 3 boys and 2 girls. We all go to a university in the city together. We saw this place by chance, but we fell in love with it." Ethan's voice was so pleasant that Adriana was ready to listen to it all night. Finally, the tension between them was gone, and Adriana even decided to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Adriana immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Michael asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this bet," answered Ethan. "We'll see." Michael had set Ethan up for a bet when they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "She's a cool girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to look at the average guy. That girl's not your type, bro." But Ethan looked at him with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really liked her very much, but his friend's words struck a blow to the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine. With heat," he said. "Want to bet?" Michael got into the game, you bet. The other friends didn't say anything about the bet, and Lisa was the only one who heard. She liked Ethan very much and followed him around, dreaming of getting him, but the boy didn't seem to notice all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him going to Adriana's place. The resentment and anger was very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Adriana greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She smiled as she stretched sweetly, remembering last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast," her aunt called her affectionately. 5 minutes and I'll be ready," Adriana said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing her clothes, she went into the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I didn't help you at all," She apologized. "Come on, it's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know you have someone to take care of you." Feeling like she might cry at any minute, she decided to change the subject. "By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight." She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. "Yes, that guy we saw at the lake came by. He wanted to meet me." Adriana's face flushed. "Well, I hope he succeeded." "He did." The girl blushed even more. "I just don't know how to behave around guys," she admitted. "You don't need to know anything. If you like him, act like your heart tells you to. Just be yourself," the woman replied. They had a lot of things planned for the day, so Adriana could only get free in the evening, and just as she entered the house, she heard a soft knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Ethan was standing in front of her, holding a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "Thank you." The girl smiled, accepting the bouquet. "How would you like to go for a walk in the village?" I don't know. I need to shower and change," the girl replied excitedly. She was desperate to go for a walk with him. "Great. I'll wait on the porch. I hope your aunt won't mind?" "I don't think so." Adriana shrugged. When Ethan was out the door, she rushed into the shower, thinking about what outfit to wear for the walk. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. Ethan was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Nancy, drinking tea and talking nicely when Adriana came up to them. "Adriana, there's a guy asking for permission to go for a walk with you. I had to meet him so I can let you go with him in peace." Adriana looked at her questioningly. "I can see he's a good guy, so I'm letting him go." Seeing her niece's tension, she hurried to leave them alone. Ethan behaved much more easily today than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Adriana learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a serious specialist in cardiology, and she, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "Cool. Can I see your paintings with interest?" asked Ethan. "They are all left at home in my studio, but I can paint a painting especially for you," she offered. "That would be great." The boy was delighted. Ethan behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself anything extra. The walk ended in the late afternoon, leaving both of them with only positive emotions. From that day on, the young people were inseparable. Ethan went to fetch Adriana in the morning, and sometimes they returned in the morning. Aunt Nancy did not discourage their meetings. On the contrary, she liked Ethan very much, and she could see that her niece was truly in love. Adriana felt that Ethan was her man, but even if he wasn't rich, that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that she realized that he had the same feelings for her as she did. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Adriana tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could not imagine that they could not be together. "This is the first time I have this," said Ethan, sitting on the shore of the lake, which became their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had girlfriends before too, but that doesn't compare to how I feel about you." The guide pulled Adriana to him and kissed her gently. "What about Lisa? Did you go out with her too?" the girl asked, smiling. "No. Although I know she wants to be with me, but now I don't need anyone but you." Ethan looked Adriana straight in the eyes. "I will love you always, no matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. She was a little embarrassed, because it was the first time she had ever heard such words. Nevertheless, the vacation was coming to an end, bringing the inevitable parting with her lover, with her aunt, and with this beautiful place, which had given her so many wonderful moments that Adriana felt that she had not lived a real life before this trip. Though she and Ethan had agreed that they would meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left Adriana. "Tonight is our last night. Tomorrow you will leave," Ethan said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again." Adriana smiled, snuggling up to the guy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a cliff surrounded by pine trees. There was a beautiful view of their favorite lake. Ethan grabbed a blanket and a picnic basket of food. "I haven't told you, but I love you very much as I possibly can." Ethan professed his love, looking Adriana straight in the eyes. There was no doubt in his sincerity. He gently touched her lips with his, pulling Adriana close to him. Tonight they decided to spend the night together, as if it was their last time together. This time, their date didn't end until dawn. In the evening, Adriana had already bought a train ticket. "I will definitely come to see you off." Ethan whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Adriana remembered her promise to give Ethan the painting. Speaking of which, it was already finished. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. She gathered herself, grabbed the gift, and headed toward the house where Ethan lived with his friends. As she got closer, Adriana felt a strange excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened by Lisa. "Please call Ethan," Adriana asked. "Ethan has gone to town." "Didn't you know?" Lisa looked at the confused Adriana with undisguised gloating. "Why would he report to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adriana sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. What's there to understand? Ethan had bet with the boys that he'd get you into bed. You were so unapproachable at first, and then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Understand? Adriana couldn't believe what she was hearing. After all, she felt Ethan loved her. Could one play a crush so skillfully? She heard Adriana say something else in her back, but she hurried out of the place. Waiting for the train on the platform, Adriana looked at the faces of passers-by, wishing she could see the one she loved among them. And she hoped that he would explain everything to her, hug and comfort her, but time passed and he was still not there. "Honey, what's wrong? Your face is gone." Her aunt was worried, seeing her off. Of course, she understood who her niece was looking for in the passers-by. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful vacation. If it hadn't been for you." Adriana stammered and cried, throwing herself on her neck. After sobbing for a few minutes, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. It never came. Adriana's mind was spinning as the train moved off, so Lisa was telling the truth. She concluded. She had some time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that it was exactly as the girl had said. Otherwise, how else would she have known that they had intimacy yesterday? Thinking about the fact that he had easily, or maybe even in great detail, told his friends about it was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment gradually replaced anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform, carefully packing her things into the car. The house met with the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Adriana that the vacation was just a dream. A note from her father, lying on the table in her room, said she would see him tonight and have an important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Adriana could barely hold back her tears. Suddenly she realized that she had no one to share her worries with. A little later, Christina came in. She sincerely missed her pupil, and so did Adriana, but something in her behavior was bothering her. The woman threw pitying glances in Adriana's direction, and when she asked for questions, she changed the subject. Her father came late in the evening, when Adriana had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and after receiving a negative answer, he quietly entered the room and sat down in the chair opposite his daughter. Adriana realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms, cuddling like a little girl. But assessing the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle on his face showed any emotion when they met. Adriana's heart clenched. Glancing at her mom's picture, Adriana dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up. I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. Many important people will be there." "I'll introduce you to a lot of people," Dad said. "Thank you, but why do I need those people? I'd rather celebrate my birthday in a family circle." Shyly objected the girl. "It's out of the question. I've decided everything. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You should outshine everyone. You have time to prepare." The father stood up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Adriana sat on the bed with her legs tucked up. The phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was her aunt writing, worried. Adriana smiled. It had probably been a long time since she had received such warmth. Communicating with Aunt Nancy helped to distract her from unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to penetrate. Adriana sighed heavily, looking out the window. The weather reflected the state of her soul to the fullest extent. Every minute she thought of Ethan and what he had done. Her heart leaped out of her chest, and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Adriana went to her small workshop. There she was finally able to forget. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Adriana wrote a portrait of her beloved that broke her heart. The girl did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Looking down, Adriana was startled. Her father was clearly drunk, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, okay. To sell the factory is to declare bankruptcy. I'll find a way out," shouted James. Adriana stepped back so her father wouldn't see her. It was the first time she had seen him like that in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Adriana thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior any other way. Slowly making her way to the kitchen so as not to run into her father, Adriana waited for Christina. "Adriana, what are you doing here at this hour?" Entering the kitchen, the woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a bit tired lately." Apparently, he decided to relax. The woman spoke quickly, not looking into the eyes of her interlocutor. "Relax? He's wasted. I've never seen him like that." "What's wrong? Do you know anything about it?" "Am I the only one in the dark? I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late." Christina tried to end the conversation quickly. That night, Adriana didn't sleep well. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. Ethan's face and Lisa laughing at her were on her mind. So she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Adriana resolutely went in search of him in his office. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was open, and she ventured in without knocking. James sat leaning back in his chair and thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent the night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Adriana?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope to have your support." The beginning didn't promise anything good, so Adriana tensed inwardly. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy, plus huge debts. What do I do about it?" "I don't know yet. But one thing is certain, you need to make arrangements for your future." James paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up. As promised, I'll throw you a big party." "But Dad..." Adriana wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic, making him seem even smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need the party, that she shouldn't spend money on it, which she didn't have, but her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled. Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. So this evening I will introduce you to your future husband," he finally finished. Adriana was so shocked that she was speechless for a while, and only after a few minutes she said in a quiet voice, "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I am a free man. Besides, there is a man I am in love with, so your plans are not destined to come true." Adriana looked at her father defiantly, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no response, so she stood up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she'd objected to her father, so it was particularly nasty, and even more so that he'd decided to control her fate without her knowledge. Opening the only surviving joint photo of her together with Ethan on her phone, the girl cried. For the next few days she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid communicating with her. She had learned from Christina that he was just as late coming home from work and almost always invariably drunk. The time on the calendar was drawing closer to her birthday. One night before going to bed, James came to reconcile with his daughter. He spoke so softly, was so affectionate, as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was still alive. So Adriana melted and listened to her father. "All I'm doing is taking care of you, sweetheart. I don't want you to stay on the streets, because anything can happen. David, he's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious groom, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked until almost midnight, and Adriana promised to think hard. In the morning, it was barely dawn, and she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew she was awake, for the village was a busy place from the early hours of the morning. She had seen it for herself. "Adriana, my girl, how good to hear you," said Aunt Nancy. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. I wanted to say so much and ask so many questions, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. "How are you doing? Why don't you say anything?" Aunt Nancy asked cautiously. I don't know," said Adriana and exclaimed. The words mixed with tears flowed by themselves. Adriana was confused but recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Aunt Nancy, has Ethan asked about me? Have you seen him?" Shyly, Adriana asked what she had long wanted to ask. "I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," Auntie answered. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. You can't marry against your will. It's the Stone Age," She was indignant. After a little more talk with her aunt, Adriana began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Auntie promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be fine. She called back, except this time the conversation did not bring Adriana comfort. She confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at David and not to take things lightly. Adriana was surprised at the change in Aunt Nancy's mood. After all, now everyone was against her. On the eve of the holiday, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear before the guests. But Adriana did not want to have fun at all. Every evening closing in her studio, she put all her pain and longing in her paintings, and her thoughts carry her back to the short time she spent with her beloved. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. At the appointed time, she and her father arrived at the restaurant. A lot of strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but it should be credited to her father, because he practically the whole evening did not leave her a step away. Looking at the faces of the guests, Adriana wondered who David was. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening, he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow song began to play, and couples began to walk to the center of the room. When Adriana looked around, she didn't notice that she was alone. Her father had disappeared unnoticed. "Can the birthday girl do me this honor and dance this slow dance with me?" Adriana heard a man's voice behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man who, smiling, was looking at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled her to him and dragged her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Adriana waited impatiently for the music to end, for the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended, and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, I am glad to welcome you to the birthday party in honor of the birthday of my only and beloved daughter." It was felt that James had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce you to my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and David." The guests clapped. Some even started whistling. Adriana was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that David is my companion from today. Please love and welcome." A satisfied smile never left the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself. He was enjoying himself, and Adriana was the only one among the crowd of guests who felt superfluous. She looked at the groom. She sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not the groom she had envisioned. She thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. Christina tried to assure her of that every evening, telling her various stories from the lives of people she knew. Adriana. In the old days, no one asked anyone about love. The parents of the bride and groom would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family. A woman told me. That's how it was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love. And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other? Adriana asked Christina. So how could I not like you? You can't find such beauty by day and night. But slowly, in the course of such discussions, Adriana began to set herself up for a favorable outcome of the acquaintance. After all, if he disgusts me, my father will not force me to marry him, the girl thought. And now, standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or maybe 15 years older than her, Adriana found herself at a complete loss. Someone came up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. Ethan's face flashed back into her imagination, so dear and beloved, and that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, holding her as if she were his property. The girl got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Tears came to her eyes. Sitting down on the couch in the hall, she let the tears flow, making sure no one was around. Tears of happiness. She suddenly heard a woman's voice. A pretty, slender brunette stood next to her with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, Adriana couldn't find anything to say." "And what can you say to a stranger?" "Don't apologize, it's fine." "Betty." The stranger held out her hand and smiled. "I have a proposition. Why don't I get us some champagne in honor of our acquaintance?" Adriana nodded. "Why not?" It wouldn't hurt to relax and distract herself a bit right now. Betty seemed like a nice girl. They sat down at a table at the end of the room and chatted casually. "You're a nice girl," said Betty. "Although, to be honest, I thought you were an arrogant know-it-all, considering who your father is," confessed the new acquaintance. Adriana couldn't find anything to say, but smiled. "My fiancé dumped me today. Can you believe it? He just said that it's over between us, and he's marrying someone else." Betty spoke with pain in her voice. "How could he? You're so beautiful." Adriana tried to calm her down. "Apparently, money decides everything in this life. No one needs love," the girl replied sadly. "I believe in love, and you do too. He will definitely regret his deed and come back." Adriana didn't have time to finish, as she noticed that David and her father were approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Betty rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving." Betty stood up and headed for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Adriana asked sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list. Don't worry, dear, I'm just protecting you from unnecessary socializing." David smiled, but the smile seemed strained, more like a grin. "Let me decide for myself what kind of communication I want and what I don't want." Adriana objected rudely and, apologizing, followed Betty. Unfortunately for her, the girl had already left the restaurant. Adriana spent the rest of the evening avoiding everyone, including her father. She wanted to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Adriana was relieved to enter her room and sit on her bed, completely drained of energy. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation would have to take place. That was what Adriana decided as she fell asleep. Waking up and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed to her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk," Adriana began abruptly. The father looked at his daughter with bewilderment. She had never used such a tone when talking to him. "I don't want to marry David. Please let him know that. The matter of your marriage is settled and is not subject to discussion," David's father repeated for the umpteenth time. "He's a very promising young man. You will certainly get along with him." "Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am. Besides, I didn't like him at all. He's arrogant and conceited. I don't want to marry him, Dad." Adriana couldn't help screaming. "Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we could be left on the street. So I'm concerned about your future. Too bad, Daddy, that for the first time in my life, I'll have to go against your will. I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten what it's like to live with someone you love?" Adriana knew she had struck a nerve. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to broach such topics with anyone. Suddenly, her father sank into a chair and lowered his head and sobbed. Adriana was shocked by what was happening, not knowing how to behave. "I have always loved your mother, just idolized. And believe me, I have not forgotten how happy it was," said my father through sobs. "After losing her, I focused on work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success, but lately things have been going from bad to worse. Competitors have been digging at me, sending various inspections. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are demanding debts, and there is nothing to pay." David offered to work together and provide financial assistance. He has great connections in all structures, and in return, he wanted to become my son-in-law. Her father looked her straight in the eye. "Please, my daughter, agree. Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm." Adriana silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Her thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint. She painted furiously, without stopping for a minute, and didn't leave until the next morning. Concerned, Christina was already waiting for her. "Adriana, what's wrong?" "Everything is fine." The girl replied dryly, "Tell my father that I agree. Let us start preparing for the wedding." When the door closed behind Christina, Adriana spoke aloud, looking at the picture of her mom. "I will do what he wants for you, Mom. I don't want him to suffer. And the fact that he made me a bargaining chip, let it remain on his conscience." From that day on, Adriana didn't care about anything that happened next. And then the days passed from one to the other in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations did not cause Adriana any interest. She saw David twice more when he came to see his father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Adriana stood in her gorgeous wedding gown, trying to control her tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The thing is that 2 weeks before the planned celebration, Adriana found out that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby would be her salvation from loneliness. There was no doubt that Ethan was the father, as Adriana was not close to anyone else. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would have a part of her favorite man, and Adriana didn't want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would David feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Adriana tried not to think about that for the moment. Aunt Nancy's absence from the party was worrying, because she wanted to see her most of all. But neither her father nor Christina could explain why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent during all Adriana's attempts to call her. The groom talked more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under cries of bitterness, he roughly raked her into an armful for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. Otherwise, it could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Unfortunately, at the end of the next day, Adriana went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The due date was almost 3 months. It had been exactly that long since she had last seen Ethan. She tried to keep thoughts of him out of her mind because they caused tears and worry, and she couldn't be nervous. She plunged into waiting for the baby. Adriana almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband, and there were strange things. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without a driver, and only when she went to her father's house could she get away from the eyes that were always watching her. Adriana lacked socialization. That's why she found a note with Betty's phone number in the pocket of her coat and dialed the number. "Betty, this is Adriana. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember." Betty answered quickly. "How are you?" "Why don't we get together?" "I'd love to." Adriana answered. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls talked a lot about everything. It even seemed to Adriana that they had known each other for many years. "How was it married?" Betty asked shyly. Sighing heavily, Adriana replied, "I don't know. We're strangers. We don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Adriana felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be David's wife." "Perhaps, but not me. I saw him for the first time on the day of the engagement, and my father had already made up his mind for me. And though my heart belongs to another man, I can't betray my father. It's important to him, and he is the only family I have," Adriana answered sadly. Betty was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Adriana had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "With whom did you meet yesterday?" he asked. As soon as Adriana came down for breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Adriana looked into David's eyes. His prickly gaze made her uncomfortable. "Okay, here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked, raising his tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Adriana shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I am not your property, David. You are mistaken, my dear, and you'll soon find out." Her husband's haughty smile resembled a grin. Adriana stood up silently and went to her room, wiping away her tears. The next evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. It couldn't go on like this. Going into her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think of such a thing?" In the evening, David told her that his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them the other day. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope you understand me?" Adriana nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Adriana wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, though it was hard not to notice her belly, which was growing by the day. At Adriana's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As she made her way down to the table, Adriana heard the sound of voices coming from the parlor. Apparently, David had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the most audible. For a moment, Adriana froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar. Her heart was pounding frantically. Her legs became absorbent cotton. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother, my wife Adriana." David introduced her. Ethan stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," he said. Behind him stood Lisa, smiling wryly. For a moment, Adriana thought she was going to faint. Noticing the pallor on her face, Ethan asked, "Are you all right? You don't look well." "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon." David laughed. "Congratulations," Ethan replied quietly. "Well, let's get to the table." Invited the owner of the house. At the table, Ethan sat across from Adriana and kept his eyes on her. Lisa was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, David, that we couldn't come to your wedding." Ethan is literally obsessed with his studies, and after he was invited to work at the Heart Center, I don't see him at home. Lisa defiantly hugged Ethan defiantly with a challenging look at a pale Adriana. "I hope you'll definitely come to our wedding." "Will it be soon?" David asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it." Ethan cut in. Adriana was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by these words. When it was time for the hot pot, David suddenly shouted, "Who do you think is going to eat this crap?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the forbidden turkey. "I thought everyone would like it." Adriana replied, confused, "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." David couldn't stop. Apparently, the strong drinks were already doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a lot of respect for turkey." Ethan stood up for Adriana. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and quickly went to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like this, and even pregnant? Hasn't time changed you at all?" Ethan asked. She deserved it. "Besides, I don't need counselors." David answered rudely. "I agree with David. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Lisa interjected. "Shut up already. You've said enough today." Ethan looked at Lisa with irritation. "Why did you come here?" "I don't suppose it was out of great affection for your cousin?" David asked, and the men went out to the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Adriana was crying in her room. The feelings that were overwhelming her were bursting out now. She realized that she still loved Ethan. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, Ethan and Lisa stayed the night. Adriana realized this when she caught Ethan having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early morning. "Hi, will you join us?" Ethan asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé, and I'll have tea in my room," answered Adriana. "Your room? Are you and David living in separate rooms? I'm sorry, but I don't think it's any of your business." Adriana sneered, and taking the cup of tea she prepared, she wanted to turn around and leave. She felt Ethan grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Adriana looked silently into his eyes, in which she was drowning by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed. Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened." Adriana's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What stupidity? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your last name." Ethan fell silent. "I don't believe you. Especially now, it doesn't matter anymore." Adriana sighed. "You don't love him and you're unhappily married now, right? That's none of your business. You made your choice back then." Adriana pulled her hand out of his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed and her heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would literally burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Betty's number and told her everything. "What do you think to do?" asked her friend. "I don't know." Adriana exclaimed, "I don't know anything." "Should you tell him that your baby is his?" Betty had long been privy to this secret. After all, lately she was the only person Adriana could share it with. The girl always sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why would he want to know that? Perhaps Lisa would soon give him her children. Adriana replied sadly, "Don't be upset. We'll think of something." Besides, your father has promised to settle things and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous. In your condition, it's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Adriana down a bit. She decided not to go downstairs that day. And the next day the guests were gone. The time passed, but the father could not get things sorted out yet. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Adriana was very worried. She had not seen Ethan again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. David looked at her like she was nothing at best, and sometimes he snapped at her, picking on her for every little thing. On the due date, Adriana gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Emily after her mother. When she looked at her, she was amazed. The baby was an exact copy of her father. Even the mole on her left cheek she inherited from him. She was met from the hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Christina and Betty. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. David came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son and hair. And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, David? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What hair are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. I mean, he was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. The girl was not part of my plans," he shouted. "Don't you worry, we'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence." Adriana replied, as calmly as possible. David laughed and pushed Adriana against the wall. "You're wrong," he hissed. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his pants, and you and your baby. Anyway, my dear wife, I advise you to think very carefully." "What's all this for?" she asked, hardly breathing. "The time will come, and you'll know everything. Be patient, my dear. But I warn you not to be silly, otherwise Daddy or Nurse may suffer, and maybe our daughter." David burst into wild laughter. The baby cried. Adriana rushed to comfort the child. Adriana was stunned. She realized that David was not normal, and now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. From the conversation, she realized that she would not get support from him. He was clearly not himself, habitually mumbling to her to bear with her a little longer. David had organized a party to celebrate the birth of the child. All his friends and Ethan and Lisa were invited. The party took place in the living room on the first floor, so Adriana preferred not to go down to the guests for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a moment. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Ethan. "May I?" he asked shyly. Adriana nodded silently. Ethan walked over to the crib and looked at the baby. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Adriana's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which Ethan looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Adriana repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you. You are even more beautiful," Ethan said affectionately. Adriana could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the very door, Lisa's voice sounded, searching for Ethan. "You have to go," Adriana said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again. At least, I'd like that very much," Ethan said quietly and walked out. 2 weeks later, the little girl fell ill. She had a fever. There were no other symptoms. She screamed all the time, and the antipyretics hardly worked at all. "Call a doctor, please," Adriana asked her husband. "No need to worry, it's just a cold," David assured her. "Please, the child is not well. Can't you see?" she begged. "All right, the doctor will come here tomorrow," David replied indifferently. All evening the girl was capricious, and by night, Adriana realized that the matter was much more serious than she thought. The girl's lips began to turn blue, and an attack of suffocation caused a wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Adriana dialed Ethan's number on her business card. "Ethan, please help. My daughter is dying," shouted Adriana into the phone. "I'll be right there. Call an ambulance. Hurry, please." Adriana couldn't find a place to go. She hurriedly gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby and rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. Ethan arrived at the same time as the ambulance and ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. David didn't come out to the noise. Apparently, he was fast asleep after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked Ethan when he and the professor left the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect. Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," answered Adriana with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course. Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," declared the professor. At that moment, the phone rang in Adriana's pocket. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the phone husband. "My daughter needs help, and I as a mother will do everything possible for this. We will not return to your house. I'll file for divorce myself." Adriana said what she had wanted to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. According to the papers, I'm the father of the child, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you. You can't do that." Adriana turned pale, realizing the trap she had fallen into. "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to go back. Otherwise, though, you'll see," said David and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Adriana felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. Ethan picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. Adriana woke up and smelled a pungent odor. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. Ethan nodded silently. "We have to register Emily under a false name, or he'll find us." Ethan didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Adriana stayed with her daughter the whole time she was preparing for the operation, only leaving to wash or eat. Ethan was always there too. He knew that David was looking for his wife all over the city, but he didn't tell Adriana. The most important thing now was the outcome of the surgery. The girl had been operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. Ethan had assisted. The few hours that Emily was in the operating room seemed to Adriana like an eternity. And only when Ethan informed her that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Adriana was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into Ethan's arms. "Emily, isn't she my daughter?" he asked a sobbing Adriana, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pressed her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reported about a major fire of one of the houses in an elite village of the city. Adriana was horrified to hear her father's address. Her father had died in the fire, suffocated and could not get out. Christina was badly injured and was in the hospital. Adriana rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson because the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Adriana. The letter was from your aunt. Don't swear, but I opened it, but I guess I've had to. It burned, but I read it. Your aunt has been ill lately, but her soul kept longing for you. She wanted to see you. She called many times. Only James forbade her to see you. He told her not to mess with your head. So she sent you a letter in pain. No one but me saw it. She bequeathed you a house in the village. She asked you not to abandon it, and at the end she signed it. I hope you will find true happiness at your roots. Christina was silent and closed her eyes. Adriana cried quietly. Suddenly she saw through the window David's car in the parking lot. She rushed down the hall, looking for an emergency exit, because Ethan was waiting for her in the car. Hurry up and find me, Adriana shouted, and the car started whistling. The mirror showed that David's Jeep was following them. God, he won't spare us. Hurry, Ethan, please, she prayed. David was gaining on them. One more leap, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, there was a fox in the oncoming lane, and David's car slammed into it at full speed. Ethan and Adriana were sitting in the emergency room. He wants to see you, the nurse announced. Adriana did not boldly enter the room where David was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started, he hissed. Why do you hate me so much? What am I doing to you? Because you are his daughter and you had to suffer. Like me, he met my mother before you were born. I was a little boy then. He tamed me. I adored him. And so did my mother. Then he met your mother and easily threw us out of his life. Mom couldn't take it anymore and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All this time I was hatching a revenge plan and following his life. You were born with a golden spoon in your mouth. You had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing at all, you know. David looked contemptuously at the surprised Adriana. And then I set a goal to succeed, to trample your family, and I almost succeeded. Adriana did not listen anymore, but silently left the room. David survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was being cared for by Betty, a friend of Adriana's. As it turned out, she had long been in love with him and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Adriana, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to dissuade David from his devious plans. A month later, Adriana and Ethan took the girl home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home in the countryside, the one that bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots.
Subscribe and click the bell.
There was no way they were going to meet. There was no chance. Their lives were like planets orbiting far apart in different orbits. Alex, a law student who had nothing to do at an expensive fashionable resort, was brought here by illness. Last winter he was depressed, and it came out of the blue. Yes, he studied for days and nights, sitting at the textbooks. Yes, he was in practice, where he saw such scum of the earth that God forbid he should meet them on a narrow path. And then one day he ran out of energy all at once. He lay with his back turned to the wall and stupidly looked at the geometric patterns of the carpet. He didn't want to eat, study, or even live. His mother and father were terribly worried. Alex was their only late son, a fictionally gentle, intelligent people. They never pressured the boy. If he was forbidden something, he understood perfectly well why. And all that could be allowed to him, allowed to get a dog, to bring home friends with a sleepover, to go with the class on a camping trip. He never heard from his father and mother no. It was the same with his choice of profession. Alex's mom worked as a people's assessor for a while. They're called nodding fields because they never challenge a judge's opinion or decision. But Mom had a girlhood crush on the judge, an attractive blue-eyed woman of about 45 years old. Mom admired people who, despite a difficult life, retain optimism and a cheerful disposition. Judge Nancy had been divorced a long time ago and was raising a deaf-mute daughter. Her husband left just because of the birth of such a sick daughter. Also a member of their family was a huge Maine Coon cat. Once there was a newspaper with a program on TV, and the cat took this paper as a special kind of invitation, meaning you can come here. The program was removed a long time ago, but we couldn't eradicate the cat's bad habit. They never turned on the TV. Nancy Helen's daughter lived in a special boarding school. She came home on weekends. Her mother was not going to marry anymore and gave all her strength to her work. In the first place, because she sincerely loved her work, and in the second place, she saved most of her earnings. She wanted to take Lena abroad for treatment. Surgery plus rehabilitation. Every day Nancy had to judge people who stole something or didn't share something or beat up or even killed. Most of all, she did not like the cases concerning the division of property, when people who had previously considered themselves relatives and were going to live together for the whole century began to fight over some closet or gold jewelry, and attacked each other with such fury that the civil case right there in the courtroom and threatened to turn into criminal. One time Alex went to pick up his mom too early. He had to wait for her. A young man named Parker was on trial. He had just been released from the zone and returned to his mistress Betty and was just beginning, so to speak, to taste freedom. In the evening they quarreled and Parker stabbed Betty. The ambulance came. Betty was drunk and didn't want to go to the hospital. They could barely convince her to get stitches. She wanted to stay with her example, who didn't understand why he'd taken up the knife. In the courtroom, they told each other they loved each other. "Betty, I'm sorry, there's no one I care about more. Parker told you. I'm going to sit down again, aren't you? I'll be waiting for you." Betty pressed his hands to his chest. This was a side of life Alex didn't know, had never encountered. Parker got 2 years and 10 months. And Betty was in the hallway excitedly discussing with her sister what to send him in first gear. Nancy felt sorry for him, Mom said as she and Alex drove home. She gave him the shortest sentence possible. He had already been convicted once, but his girlfriend was almost on her knees, assuring him that she held no grudge against him. Alex seemed to be thinking about something of his own. But isn't that when he started reading different literature? Not like before. If before he was interested in adventures, now they were replaced by detectives, books about the elusive, criminals, bloody maniacs, their kidnapper, and domestic violence. In Alex's senior year of high school, he told his parents he wanted to become an investigator. Mom was scared. It's dangerous. Can't you choose some more peaceful profession? Dad objected. Alex is not likely to go into a dangerous line of work. I think he'll work in our small town, and soon all romance will be dispelled. He'll have to investigate a case like the one where a homeless man broke into an apartment and stole a laptop to drink it away. So I'd like to know, wouldn't a chore like this turn him away from the legal profession? Alex wasn't in the mood to open up. So he briefly said, "We'll just have to wait and see." And during the years of study, he really had to see a lot of things that were too cruel, rough, ruthless. Practice was coming to an end, and again lectures were replaced by seminars. And at home he had to study reports, prepare term papers, and then look at the subject of his diploma. I studied every day until late at night. And finally, from the accumulated fatigue, and there was that very nervous breakdown. He became depressed. Parents were worried God knows where the money came from and bought him a trip to an expensive sanatorium by the sea. Alex didn't even want to go. What difference, where he will lie for hours in a fetal position in a city apartment on the 8th floor or in a local room, 100 meters from the sea. But suddenly the change of place did him good. In the sanatorium, the doctor began to treat him the old-fashioned way. He did not prescribe expensive procedures for the young man. Different spa healing climates, sea bathing, long walks, and drinks with soothing concoctions that were given at the bar had to do the trick. And after a few days, Alex felt that the air here was really healing, and he began to fall asleep easily in the evening. Sleeping soundly at night, he stopped having nightmares, and early in the morning he was greeted by the sea, clear as a tear, which washed away all the negativity and got rid of heavy thoughts for breakfast. Alex came with a wolfish appetite from even milk porridge, which he did not like before. At the table, his neighbors were a father with a small daughter and a middle-aged woman. The little girl had a pretty face. Her hair was twisted into 2 thick pigtails. She chattered amusingly, and somehow it so happened that if the little girl was given peaches or cakes, everyone at the table was happy to give them to the little girl. Her daddy, Benjamin, smiled embarrassed and grateful. The middle-aged woman's name was Helen. She was unusually silent. It was clear that she was a wealthy woman. What was the jewelry alone? In the ring and hid a large diamond earrings with the same gemstones attracted admiring glances. Helen's short-cropped hair was kept small, which she dressed simply, but not a single thing looked cheap. And also the open things that women in the South love so much. Helen wore no loincloths, short skirts, over t-shirts. She always threw on a long-sleeved shirt or jacket. Helen probably did this then to hide her painful thinness. She seemed not just slim, but truly emaciated. Alex thought she must be on some fancy diet. Sometimes Helen sat down at the table, drank only a glass of tea, and left immediately. Sometimes, without any appetite, she would pick at the second course with a spoon and leave the plate. It was still rare when I managed to meet her gaze. If the neighbors at the table were talking to her, Helen answered, looking somewhere past, and her answers were always complicated and her voice quiet, as if she was afraid to say an extra word. Alex never met her either on the beach or on excursions, and they were organized almost every day in the sanatorium. You could see Helen only on the farthest paths, and that's not immediately noticeable, sitting on a bench somewhere, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, enjoying the solitude. Alex didn't really care. He was glad that he was starting to come to life himself. There was an interest in life. For the first time in many months, he began to make some plans. Periodically, all vacationers in the sanatorium had to visit the doctor to check how the treatment was going. What was the result? Alex waited for his turn. Sitting in the corridor at the doctor was Helen. The door was slightly open, and Alex heard her voice, characteristic, slightly stated, "To great regret, we were not able to help you. Isn't that right?" Sebastian asked the woman softly. "Well, probably, if I hadn't come to you, I would have been worse off." Helen tried to answer delicately. "You haven't put on weight." "Not a bit." "Blood pressure still spiking," Sebastian listed. "And the psychologist says your anxiety level hasn't gotten any lower." "That's right." Silence. Alex imagined Helen nodded. "That's right," Sebastian summarized. "Until it's removed. The root cause you won't recover. I would recommend that you see a psychiatrist when you arrive. Apparently chemistry should already be involved here. Have him find some medication." No, Alex has never heard Helen speak so loudly and with so much excitement. "It's impossible for me. Even then, I proved with great difficulty that I'm not mentally ill." That's the only reason he got jail time. After all, he presented the case so that I made up everything with an unstable person psycho and make hysterics. Jealous of everything and everyone. Plus a vivid imagination. And it's a done deal. But you didn't do the beating yourself. Sebastian was still talking softly. "It's still a basic fact. Didn't I tell you? He somehow convinced my friends, ex-girlfriends, to testify that I've been weird since I was young, that I can cut myself and stuff like that." Okay, apparently the doctor preferred not to go into all that. There was silence. Sebastian must have been writing. "Get it at the nearest drugstore. These are sleeping pills. They're a prescription drug. And for the last few days you'll be here, get some sleep, and don't think about anything. I strongly advise you to go home. Let not psychiatrist, let psychotherapist. No one will put you on the register. But as you do not realize, you will not be able to live fully, will not be able to enjoy life, if you do not work on this problem. How much life is left in there, doctor?" Helen abruptly pushed back her chair. A couple of moments later, the door opened, and without looking at Alex, the woman walked quickly down the corridor. For some reason, all day long the young man couldn't forget about this conversation. He waited for dinner to see Helen in the dining room. Usually she was always a little late. They served very pretty cakes for dessert, baskets with cream and fruit. Alex automatically handed his to Ninotchka, while he looked out the door every now and then. But Helen never appeared. The next day Alex, as usual, went to the beach. Early in the morning he liked those hours, when there was still no one here. But who among the vacationers would really think of getting up at 5? Only a few fishermen could be found on the shore. But suddenly he saw Helen. The woman was sitting on a chaise lounge under the awning, although the sun had just descended. But one could see Helen. But you could see Helen, and here wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible. She was wearing a denim fiber skirt, long to her heels, and some kind of stretchy sweater that Helen was tangled in. She sat with her arms around her knees and stared in front of her. Alex didn't want to disturb her and was about to discreetly retreat, but then she looked at him. They nodded to each other. "Good morning, can't sleep," he said. Because he had to say something. As it turns out, even the pills don't work for me. Helen grinned. Alex didn't expect her to answer. She hadn't told anything about herself until now. "And I was tired of studying," he said. "Have a seat on the next slogan. Once I decided to give myself a break. That made it easier. Maybe you should also not think about unpleasant things." As Helen looked him straight in the eyes. "Can you do that? Teach me. How do I do that?" Suddenly tears came to her eyes. Helen bit her lip and stared at the sea. He could think of nothing but the trivial. But there are no unsolvable problems in the world. "Only if someone died, I died," Helen said. Isn't it obvious? Helen grew up with a stepmother, and once wanted more than anything to have her own home and her own family. Though everyone around her admired her father, her stepmother, and all 3 of Helen's children, and her 2 free, younger brothers. Her father was a scientist, a university lecturer, soft in family life, and a professor who was passionate about science to the point of madness. He forgot about food and sleep. If it was about his favorite science, his first wife died a few days after the birth of Helen. On the face of it was not so rare reason. A medical oversight. Later, someone changed all the records. I didn't punish anyone for that story. No one was suspended. And the grief-stricken professor never tried to get justice. Perhaps he wanted to raise his daughter on his own and never marry again. But after a few years, he met a young woman, whom he sincerely admired, as he did. Maria was in love with science, which means that she lived a spiritual life in words, and everything material was of secondary importance to her. The professor very quickly proposed to her, and Maria was not afraid to marry a man with a child. 2 years later, she gave birth to twins and decided that she had had enough of children, although the professor had hired her an assistant from the beginning. Still, the small children demanded too much attention. The housekeeper took over the household, cooking, washing, cleaning. But her mother didn't trust her to raise the boys. Maria wanted to raise her sons in her own image. Spiritual came first. One couldn't put too much value on things. Not even the fact that the couple's child saw toys as living things. No discount was made. A few times a year, the mother would pack plush animals, cars, and the like into a large cardboard box and give it to a woman she knew. A poor woman with many children. And God forbid that the boys would regret something, of course. In exchange for the given toys were bought new dressed boys were also not worse than their peers. But since they were little, they knew not to dream about things. Fashionable backpack or in one ship, which itself will swim in the bathtub, grinds the water with a propeller. But about this or that book, or that recovered father, who had a heart condition, you can dream quite well. With the boys, this issue passed. They obeyed their mother, at least for the time being. But Maria, from the very beginning, tried to apply this method of upbringing and stepdaughter. However, she was disappointed. Helen did not accept the punishments. She cried. One time, she even had a nervous attack. Her father promised Helen for her birthday the same lush princess dress that the girl's friends had. Most likely, the professor didn't understand what it was all about at all. But he had the pleasure of going with Helen to the store and pleasing her with a grade. Helen was so excited about the gift, made on the eve of her birthday, that she put on the dress, not wanting to take it off. When she was nevertheless persuaded to change into a nightgown before going to bed, her stepmother took the dress and hung it up in the closet in the room, saying she would allow the outfit to be worn on holidays. Helen, from whose hands the coveted article had been snatched, burst into tears so that her hands began to tremble, and the next day she had a fever. And instead of a holiday with a cake and candles and balloons, instead of fun with her friends, Helen lay in bed in semi-oblivion. Then the father and stepmother had a long talk behind closed doors, and the stepmother backed off from raising her stepdaughter. She forbade Helen practically nothing else. The girl simply ceased to exist for her. If Helen addressed her with any question, Maria answered to ask her father. The professor was so busy, so far from real life, that very soon the girl had to become independent. Sometimes she asked her father about her own mother. Tears invariably came to the professor's eyes. Katya was so sweet, cheerful, with an easy character, that with her death all joy left the house. Apparently Helen had taken after her mother in many ways. She tried to arrange for two factions to form in the house. After all, Maria has sons. The girl reasoned, so let her be with Benjamin and Tony, the three of them, and they will not be bored. And Daddy's mine. Otherwise it's not fair. They're together and I'm alone. But the stepmother was quick to put an end to her daughter's claim to her father's attention. She believed that no one can be closer to her husband than herself. They work together, they have common interests. And Helen is growing up. And soon she will have her own life and her own spouse. Thus, the girl's relatives were replaced by her friends. She often stayed with them for days at a time. Her friends' parents didn't mind. No matter what, Helen was well, raised in a friendly manner, always tried to help with the housework. Sometimes someone would say, "I wish I had a daughter like that." Helen would only flinch. Apparently, deep down, it was weighing on her. The fact that, unlike her peers, she did not have a normal family, and she really wanted to have one. No one came to Helen's graduation. The professor was very busy. There was some important meeting of the scientific department. He asked his wife to go to the school, but at least for the solemn part of the awarding of certificates. But Maria made a distant sign. "I haven't been involved in Helen's education for a long time. I don't want to be a hypocrite, participating in this celebration." The professor only shrugged his shoulders and smiled guiltily at his daughter. "I apologized for the way things turned out." However, Helen was already hardened by life, and she only grinned. She did not expect anything else. However, the behavior of her father she still assessed as a betrayal and chose a university for herself in another city. Her father rented her an apartment. Here you have to give justice. The stepmother never interfered if the father spent money on his daughter. "I know for myself in the hostel, and it is difficult to study well," said the professor. "There you stay up late, you bring friends. And if you are going to study seriously, you need a quiet and working environment." He went with his daughter, visited her new apartment, gave a generous sum of money for Helen to buy everything she needed. But when the girl became a student, her behavior changed. It's as if she got to all sorts of entertainment. Now she often lingered in nightclubs, carefree fun with new friends. They could drink so much that they could hardly tell the cab driver their home address. And boys for the evening to pick up and afford any other craziness. And Helen dressed in ways she never would have thought possible. She used to wear bright, flashy things. She used to leave her hair loose. She was naturally very good-looking, and she was never without male attention. Another thing is that now she remained as kind and trusting as she had always been. She was introduced to Leo by a classmate. Julia had a boyfriend, and he had a friend. Why not sit together with the same company? They were already settled at a table in a cafe. The friend's boyfriend was running late. But when he showed up, Julia's face stretched. She must have thought she blundered. Finished with the wrong guy. Suddenly he looked like he'd stepped out of the pages of a men's fashion magazine. No, in this case it didn't matter what he was wearing, but that hard face. The sneer. Such bright eyes and black eyebrows in the span of a young girl is covered with pictures of such a Superman. His bedroom. It was strange that Leo still didn't have a girlfriend. He willingly took on the role of Helen's beau. For the rest of the evening, he took care of her, pouring her wine, laughing at her jokes. And when the party was over, he walked her home. Perhaps it could have been limited to a few kisses goodbye. But Helen saw no reason why not. Why shouldn't they end a wonderful evening? On an equally marvelous night, she took her new pal by the hand and carried him back to her house. And indeed, the night was so intoxicating that in the morning both didn't want to part. That was where it all began. The romance spun up most impetuously, and 2 weeks did not pass. Leo confessed his love to Helen and asked her to marry him. She was amazed at such a hasty decision, especially since, having looked at her family, she did not want to get a stamp in her passport as soon as possible. Girlfriends met the news differently. Someone who enthusiastically forbade and began to ask for a wedding, preferably as a witness. Someone who has already seen the handsome Leo and frankly invited. And Sophia's closest friend only shook her head. Sophia was not a prude at all. She was happy to open up at the same parties that Helen was happy to pick up guys for one night. So Helen was all the more surprised. "What do you like?" she asked. "I'm not getting married yet, but you should have seen how beautifully he proposed to me. All honorable." On her knees, with a bouquet of flowers and a stunning gilt diamond ring, Helen showed her hand with a dainty ring. "I said I would think about it." With poorly concealed pride, she said, "And at any rate, as long as I wear the ring, I will be faithful to it." And what did he interrogate Sophia about? "It seemed to me that he was very upset that I had not consented," Helen confessed at once. "I think he imagined that I would turn, throw myself on his neck, and confess my eternal love in return." Sophia shook her head again. "I haven't had any experience of my own family life, of course," she said. "But I don't often see guys of that age getting married so quickly. So far, I've only seen a few cases of young men proposing marriage so quickly. And you know who they were talking about? Alcohol. And both of them were already incorrigible, or, as they say, incurable. And they'd already tried marriage, but their wives couldn't take it for long." "You mean he drinks?" Helen laughed. "I'm gonna disappoint you, but I'm a leader in this business. You know I sometimes can't resist an extra cocktail, and he doesn't even guzzle. He's driving. What do you know about him?" Sophia kept up. "Well, his father left the family early. His mother raised him, but she was difficult. She drove men around and paid little attention to her son. Maybe that's what we have in common. Neither he nor I had a normal family." "Maybe," Sophia agreed thoughtfully. "But if I were to advise you to look for a husband, it would be among those guys who had a normal, good family, where the father was used to taking care of the mother, whose son saw that." "And I lazily pitied with unexpected seriousness," said Helen. "He, like me, wanted warmth at home, and his mother gave all her warmth to strange men. He hoped that she would at least give birth to another child, and he would have a brother or sister to take care of. But no. He grew up a lonely orphan with a living mother. But you're not going to run off and marry him right now, are you?" "No, of course not." Helen sounded concerned. "I've already messed up my studies with these affairs. I have debts for the last session. There's no way I can retake it, and I have to do it. It would be a big blow to my father if I suddenly dropped out of the institute. He's the one who pays my rent and gives me money to live on." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "So far you've had it easy. But if you lose your allowance, you'll have to work part-time like many other students." Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worst for Helen, which she once again came to retake the course. The teacher, who already disliked her, tried to do everything to stump the girl. He asked unexpected questions, demanded knowledge of additional material. Helen had spent several sleepless nights preparing for the exam, and now she had everything mixed up in her head. She ended up getting another D. In the study section, she was told that, in general, if she did not want to be expelled, she had two options: or take a leave of absence for whatever reason or switch to a paid department. The girl was not satisfied with both options, but the second was worse than the first. Studying was expensive. She could not take this load on her father. It remained to take an academic classmate, whose mother was a gynecologist, asked her to make a fake pregnancy certificate. Helen was given a sabbatical leave. The girl decided to get a job in a cafe, save up some money. And if she couldn't recover next year, she'd pay for her own tuition. But Leo, when he found out what had happened, insisted on marriage with redoubled force. "You won't be dependent on your father," he urged. "I earn enough. If you want to, you'll study further. Do you want to? No. Don't you like the prospect of being your own boss?" Helen resisted for a while. She did get a job as a waitress in a small restaurant, but she didn't last long. First, she was snapped at by a customer who thought Helen was too clumsy and sloppy. Then her companions accused her of cheating on her tips. In this restaurant, it was customary to deposit tips in a common pot, and then to distribute them. And most of it went to those who had worked here for a long time. The newcomers, on the other hand, got the crumbs. This unwritten rule seemed so unfair to Helen that she actually arranged for some of the money that visitors gave her. In short, the girl was out on the street. And that's when she went to the registry office with Leo. They took the application, and the glowing groom asked her what kind of wedding she wanted. Something modest? Helen asked, "You don't have to spend a lot of money on all this tinsel. I'm fine if we get a table somewhere." "Oh, that's fine." Leo seems to be okay with that. "I wouldn't want to be the lead in a play where everyone's staring at you." Helen laughed at you. "You're the one who's handsome like a movie star." "Not me. I'll be invited. By the way, I haven't been to your house yet. You haven't met my family. My relatives live on the other side of the country and are unlikely to come to the wedding. I'd love to show you the house next weekend. Only now it seems too small. I never thought about it before. But now that I've met you, I want a big, very big family." Helen only laughed. No, she didn't mind children. But first, he'd have to get his degree. The day before the wedding, he gave her a present. They were to go on a wedding trip, but it was supposed to be special, just like he was special. He rented a cottage by a lake in one of the northern regions, but you probably can't swim there. Yes? Helen mumbled confusedly. She had assumed that they would go somewhere after the wedding. But she imagined that it would be the South, maybe Turkey or one of the European countries. Even the Krasnodar region. Sea, sun, fruit. A room in a nice hotel. They would get up at dawn and walk along the beach, holding hands. But Leo even grumbled. "You can't find privacy there in season with so many people. The beaches are jammed with excursion crowds, and I want you and me to be alone." And after a few days, Helen was convinced that her husband was right. Instead, he chose a wonderful retreat and a cottage in the woods, surrounded by huge picturesque fir trees. How wonderful the pine needles smelled. It took a few minutes to walk along the wooden planking to the lake and sit on the bridges and admire the view. The water in the lake was the clearest and not so cold. They enjoyed swimming several times a day. The cottage was small, but Helen fell in love with it. 2 bedrooms, the second one was obviously unnecessary. A cozy kitchen finished in wood and a living room with a window and a fireplace. The ceiling-high refrigerator was filled with groceries and newlyweds. There was no need to drive to the nearest town, although it was a quarter of an hour at most by car. Helen had never had such a good time. They would actually get up at dawn, have coffee on the terrace, and then the whole day belonged to them. One could walk along forest paths, discovering new picturesque corners. You can splash as much as you like in the clear, clean water. On rainy days, one could read by the fireplace, listening to the sound of the rain. And that night they spent under the open sky, sheltered by a single plaid, with the same old starry river flowing over their heads. Helen had forgotten to bring her birth control pills. Going through the small medicine cabinet, she discovered they were gone, although she thought she had put them in with her medication. At first, she was saddened by this, but then she waved goodbye. And she felt so good next to Leo that she thought, as it will be, so it will be. She was sure her husband would solve any problem with him. She would not have to think about her daily bread, or about the fact that the child lacked something. In this corner of paradise, Helen felt as if she had rested for all the past years. She felt truly loved and desired. So she didn't want to go back to normal life. But Leo had promised her another surprise, and he was not wrong in promising that his house would make her admire him. She hadn't expected her husband to be such a wealthy man. It was a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of town. It wasn't exactly a high-profile place. It's not the waterfront, but it's near the woods. You could look at it and reminisce about your wedding trip. High, low fence, automatic opening doors. I'll be safe for you here, Leo said. No one's gonna steal you away from me. Who needs me? Helen started to pay and went to look at her new possessions. The house was not that big. A kitchen on the first floor and a living room on the first floor. 3 rooms, bedroom, study. And the third one Leo said would be a nursery. Last of all, he showed her the basement. Most of it was set up as a gymnasium. There was also a small room. According to Leo, Helen's eyes shone for storage of all kinds of junk. She mentally envisioned making this the most beautiful house in the world. She didn't know exactly how much Leo earned, but she was sure that she would have enough for various transformations. And she'd be working soon, too. Don't you have some blag to find me a place? She asked at dinner. Helen always tried to turn dinner into a little celebration. Not only cooked something tasty, but also beautifully set. Our table. She'd set glasses, pour wine and talk. Under such a feast was usually the most pleasant. But now Leo looked up at her in surprise. Why do you have to work? Helen was confused. I always thought that I should not sit on my neck. You're not sitting on my neck. I always thought I'd patronize and pamper my wife. She wouldn't have to work for someone else's uncle and put up with his whims. Helen was very pleased to hear this, and the conversation ended there. A week later, however, the young woman returned to him. Now Leo went to work every morning, and Helen spent the whole day alone. In addition, her husband always returned at different times. You can't guess what time to make dinner so that everything is hot. I'm thinking of getting a job, she said. She poured her husband coffee again and added, well, I'm here all day by myself. You're not going to watch TV or read all day long, are you? I should at least get my license. I could go to a friend's house or shopping. And if you were babysitting, you'd be bored too. Leo looked at her carefully. But that's another matter. Helen even laughed. My familiar girls say that the first time after childbirth, and so you go like a zombie with one single dream to sleep. So why should you get a job now and then go straight to maternity leave? Leo asked. But I still want to finish the institute first. You can't even imagine. What a disappointment it will be for Dad if I don't have a diploma. Helen protested. Dad lives only for his science. Leo shrugged, and a few days later Helen took a test and found out she was pregnant. Leo organized a real celebration. Helen wanted to invite Sophia, her closest friend, but he objected. This is the most important moment in our family's life. We don't need outsiders. But there were flowers and very expensive champagne and ice cream. Helen's favorite sweet, which she preferred to cakes and pastries. Leo immediately said that she would be observed and give birth in a private clinic. No flow doctor who will behave from the beginning and up to the delivery. The most attentive attitude, separate room. Of course, Helen could not help but be grateful to her husband for such care. But privacy has already begun, a little burdensome for her. However, the doctor who brought her, Leo sent Helen to all sorts of examinations, and the results were not too pleased. And you look healthier and stronger than you really are. But things aren't going so well. Something's threatening the baby. Is Helen scared? Not if you follow all the recommendations. The doctor said to stick to bed rest. At any moment, you could become dizzy, uncoordinated. You should be able to sit or lie down. I see. Leo, who was present during the examination, asked his wife affectionately, so you can't leave the house, dear. And just in case you don't run away, I'll take away your keys. He turned the matter into a joke. But soon Helen actually discovered that a set of keys was missing from her purse. It's not funny, she said. You're missing your husband for a long time. I might need something. It's not like I'm going to turn into a forge with no freedom. When the baby comes, everything will change. He promised her, and Helen had to accept it. Leo locked the gate securely when he left in the mornings. So Helen really felt like a prisoner trapped within 4 walls. But at least I can have visitors. She couldn't stand it. Leo raised his eyebrows. Who do you want to see? At least Sophia. It's been forever since we've met. He thought for a few moments. Okay, invite her over for the weekend when I'm home too. Sunday night went wonderfully. Sophia had brought good wine and some toys for the baby to grow up with, she joked. The couple gave her a tour of the house, and then all sat together on the rug in the living room, lapping light sweet wine and talking. The terms of the news had piled up. Helen, too, wanted to talk about her life, to complain about how much she missed her. But Leo was sitting next to her. It was kind of uncomfortable in front of him. If he'd gone somewhere, well, even for a quarter of an hour. But he wouldn't leave his girlfriends. True, he behaved with extraordinary gallantry and tried to charm Sophia. The only moment they had alone together was when Sophia asked to go to the bathroom. "I'll show you the bathroom." Helen jumped up. "How do you live?" Sophia asked, as she slept nodded her hands. Even if Leo stood under the door from behind the noise of the water, he heard nothing. Everything is normal. Well, yeah, pretty much. Helen really wanted to tell her how much she longed, but she was afraid Sophia wouldn't understand. After all, the way she was living now was dictated by Leo's care for her. "I thought you were locked up like a bird in a cage." "No," Sophia asked obliquely. "He's a good macho guy, but if you decide to run away from him, I understand. And by the way, if you want, you can stay at my place." Sophia had a small apartment, a studio, where she had lovingly designed every corner. There was room for bookshelves, a good record player, and even a small bar. And the loggia Sophia spotted and arranged there a working office, combined with a greenhouse. But only a baby crib will not fit there. And yet Helen had tears in her eyes. Sophia, it turns out, understood her. "Thank you," she whispered. That same evening, when she went to bed, Helen asked her husband, "Can Sophia come to visit us more often? I have more fun with her. I won't have to ask to go anywhere." If she was hoping to take her husband away, she was wrong. "Your girlfriend will not come to our house again," Leo said. "Why not?" Helen was stunned. "You should have thought of bringing wine to a pregnant woman." "I hardly ever drink," Helen justified herself. "You don't need a glass, but I wouldn't let you have more. If she shows up next time without me, how do I know what she's carrying? Maybe a bottle of whiskey. I assure you she wouldn't think twice. And I say what would. You're a kind soul. You don't know how jealous people can be. If something happened to your baby, your Sophia will comfort you. And in your heart you'll be glad it happened. You don't think she's jealous of you now. That you have a husband, a nice house, that you're pregnant, and that she has a job and a room the size of a dog kennel. I bet she drinks a lot and is willing to sleep with anyone she meets." Helen was hit by a wave of icy indignation. "You don't know her at all," she said coldly. "You haven't told me anything about your family. When I asked about it, you gave me complicated answers. But I can tell you about my family. I had no mother. I grew up with a stepmother. I never had a sister. Well, Sophia is the sister I've been missing my whole life. And she successfully dragged you to all sorts of companies, all sorts of bad places. What kind of hot spots? I'm imagining things. If we went to coffee shops or nightclubs, then I'm in the clear. You do realize what kind of people go there, right? Men come to eat girls like this." "I'm a girl," Helen said. "I didn't say that, but with that dog you could act like a girl. Look, I'm not asking you where exactly you work or who you're around. You know I run a security firm. And it's all men. So maybe you're hooking up with them." Romans asked Helen in anger. He slapped her on the cheek. No one had ever hit her before. And to raise a hand on a pregnant woman. Helen recoiled and cried. "There is no greater insult to a man than what you just said to me." Leo walked out, slamming the door. Helen cried for a long time, but the room was so quiet, not a single sound coming from the room, and she gradually began to calm down. The very surroundings had a calming effect on her. It was so beautiful in her room. Everything in soft pink colors. In the end, she came to realize that it was largely her own fault. Men have certain red lines they can't cross. And she had apparently violated the unspoken prohibition. Still, Helen thought that her husband would apologize to her, and she would try to forget the horrible scene. She and her husband spent the night apart. Helen fell into an unexpectedly deep sleep after many tears. She woke up several times, and each time she checked to see if Leo was there. It seemed to her that he must be there. After all, loving people always understand if they have hurt someone else and try to earn forgiveness, even if they are not guilty. But Leo did not come. In the morning, Helen heard that her husband was going to work. She couldn't believe that he was going for nothing. Besides, she wanted to eat too. So she casually walked into the kitchen where he was finishing breakfast, poured herself a cup of coffee, and made a sandwich. "What should I buy today?" Leo asked, as if nothing was wrong. "Will you write a list?" She usually gave him a shopping list with her, except for the very first few days when she was nauseous. So it lay in a thumb drive. But now Helen opened her eyes in surprise. It was as if Leo had forgotten everything that had happened yesterday. "You hit me," she said. And I was surprised at him. It just couldn't have happened. "You had a bad dream." "Don't you remember anything?" "No," I shook my head. "But if I upset you, I'm sorry. So what should I buy today?" Helen made a short list of groceries. When her husband left, she wanted to lounge on the couch with her phone, as usual. She was used to reading books from digital libraries lately, but she couldn't find her cell phone. In vain. She looked for it all over the room, checked the bathroom, looked in every nook and cranny in the living room and kitchen. There was no cell phone. She remembered that there was a landline in the house and decided to call her own cell phone from it. Then she would hear a familiar tune and find the missing cell phone. But it turned out that the landline phone was disconnected. That day, Helen was unusually bored. She didn't know what to do until her husband arrived. She had long since weaned herself off the television. Walking was only possible in the small garden. You can't go beyond the fence. The gate is locked. Shit, she can't even contact Sophia. If the cell phone is somehow lost, Sophia could buy a new one, and she would give her friend the money later. When Leo arrived in the evening, the first thing Helen asked him was if he knew where the phone was. Though in her heart she was sure he would answer no. All the more startled by his words. "You don't want the phone." "How's that?" She sat like that. "You'll be calling your friends, talking about your life to me. And I don't want anyone dragging my name around. Especially not dirty girls like Sophia. And you say you don't remember the scene last night." Helen summarized bitterly. "I'm afraid it will be exactly the same today. I don't know what you mean, but all that cell phone service and radiation. I don't think it's good for the baby." Helen laughed, but it sounded almost hysterical. "Look, this isn't the Stone Age, and everyone has a cell phone. I don't part with mine." And I know his voice was calm, like he was talking to a baby, "but it's not good for you. Look at you now, your nerves are shot. And I need to keep you safe from any anxiety. Give me the phone, and I'll calm down. I brought you something else." Leo went out and came back with a small flat box. "You say you mostly read books on the internet? I bought you an ebook, and at my request, they put 100 detectives and love stories in it. When you read it, everyone tells me I'll announce your library. But that's not what this is. Do you have a TV for the news? What else do you need? I need to be able to contact someone. You're out all day. What if something happens to me? Get sick? I'd have to call an ambulance to get you out of work. Now I won't leave you so long." Leo said affectionately, "I'll stop by in the middle of the day to see if you're all right." And he did visit her once or twice a day. He always came at different times, and he didn't stay long, sometimes only for a few minutes, to make sure everything was all right. Helen panted, wandering around the rooms. An e-book couldn't replace the internet for her. She realized that she had complained about loneliness for nothing before. She could sit on forums, chat in chat rooms. She could contact the same Sophia through social networks. Now she was deprived of all that. The books her husband had downloaded for her were cheap reading and couldn't occupy her thoughts. Does he really care about me that much? She asked herself, but it's really choking me. Hormones were probably affecting her too, because she didn't recognize herself. Every now and then she started crying like a hurt child and felt very unhappy. A few days later, Helen told her husband, "I can't go on like this. I'm leaving you." He was just finishing his lunch and gave a marvelous green pea. Leo raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Where are you going to go? Shouldn't you care?" She answered defiantly. "I understand," he said calmly. Now he spoke with more than just that tone you wanted to live with your Sophia, until the divorce was finalized, and then have a baby, get a job, and get child support. I painted the right picture. So what? 1,000 women live like that? Helen twitchy chin. But you're not gonna live like that. First of all, you're not going anywhere because you're carrying my baby, and I'm not going to give you the opportunity to steal it from me. I'm not going to steal. Helen realized for the first time that her husband might not just let her go. Just like that. Will you be able to see him? He shook his head. I don't like it. But don't you realize what's made me unhappy? You're not yourself right now. Leo took his time and poured coffee for both of them. Then when the baby comes, you'll think you're crazy for a while. It's okay, it'll get better. You'll see. But you can't stop me from leaving. You're a free man. But so am I. Are you sick now? Leo tried to stroke his wife's arm, but she pulled her back. The sick are taken care of without asking for their consent. I will leave, Helen said not so confidently. No, you won't. But if you want to, you can try. When did Leo leave? Helen walked around the castle one more time and realized that her husband was right. Maybe a man trained and physically strong would be able to get out of here. But not a pregnant woman whose eyes darken every now and then and for whom physical effort is contraindicated. The wall is high and topped with metal peaks. She has no phone now. The gate is on an automatic lock. The house is set back from the other buildings, and there's no way that if she screams, anyone will hear her. And besides, it would be a lot easier for Leo to make her look crazy. Helen remembered an acquaintance who had an elderly mother. Emily would go to work in the mornings, and the old lady would open the window and scream that she was being murdered. Called her daughter for help. Her greatest fear was that her mother would fall out. So she finally put bars on the windows. The mother was sedated, but nothing worked. Her screams echoed down the street. Another thing, the neighbors were aware of what was going on and did not rush old ladies to help. Nevertheless, Helen tried to climb up to the attic. The roof of the house was flat, and part of it was a kind of observation platform. But Leo had made provision for that. The entrance to the attic was locked. The young woman cried once again. In her heart, she hoped that she would somehow find a way to escape and would be among her own people today. But it turned out that escape would have to be postponed until later. As a last resort, she would run away from the maternity hospital. Better yet, she'll tell everyone around her. The doctor, the nurses, the women in labor. That Leo turned the house into a prison. He's kept her imprisoned her entire pregnancy, and now needed to help her sneak out of the maternity ward with the baby. Helen didn't much care where she went. She could stay at Sophia's for a while. Cramped, but not too cramped. Then maybe she could find some work so that she could afford a nanny for the baby. At the very least, she'll move in with her father. He wouldn't kick her out of the house. Thoughts of her father brought her back to the institute, which Helen had forgotten all about. Her father still thinks she's studying, doesn't he? He sends her money for the apartment, and it is saved on her card. But Leo has the card too, as well as all family documents, passports, policies. He hid them all in the home safe under the pretext that Helen's absent-mindedness is not worth losing documents at the most inopportune moment. When we get to the maternity hospital, we'll find out that you left everything at home and can't remember where your passport is. That's when Leo was telling her all this. His words had sounded like a joke, but now Helen realized that she was the door behind which she was, figuratively speaking, locked. Another shift appeared. It would be okay if she could get away. Sophia will give her money for a cab, and her father won't ask for his own daughter's papers. If Leo won't give her passport back, Helen will recover it later. She'll say she lost it. In the meantime, maybe try another way to give up food. If she goes on a hunger strike, Leo will have to do what she wants. After all, he's so looking forward to this baby. He will not allow Helen to starve. It could be bad for the baby. And on this day, she didn't make dinner. When her husband returned, Helen sat in her room on the wide windowsill and looked out of the window. It was raining. There was a fence and wet lilac bushes in front of her eyes. She knew her husband was about to make sure there was nothing to eat if he made a scandal. Well, Helen was ready for that. Instead, Leo was rattling around in the kitchen. Half an hour later, he walked in on her. Let's go to dinner. Everything's on the table. I'm not hungry, Helen said without turning from the window. "You don't feel well." He became alarmed. "Can you take it that way? There's hot soup and rolls waiting for you. Coffee, of course." Helen was very hungry, but she was sure she could stand it, and only shook her head negatively, saying, "I won't go." "If you don't break the regimen," Leo kept talking to her like a child, "we'll go out this weekend. We'll walk in the park, have ice cream. You've really been away from home, haven't you?" Helen couldn't believe her ears. Leo couldn't realize that when she was outside the gate, she would leave him immediately. She'd jump out of the car. For that matter. Yeah, he nodded. "I'm not kidding." "Well said, Helen. I'll be right down." She cleaned herself up a bit, washed her face, and changed her pajamas for a robe. She didn't like to walk around, unraveled. But until this minute her mood had been so bad that she didn't feel like doing anything. Now it was different. "So pull yourself together," her husband said to her at dinner. "If you don't feel well, of course we won't go anywhere. But if everything will be normal, then I intend to treat you a little. Shall we go to the store and get you something? You'll soon be able to wear the clothes you're used to." It was Monday, and all week Helen had behaved exemplarily. Now she had no doubt that she would be free before the deadline. She did the usual household chores, and at the same time her head was full of thoughts. If Sophia had guessed and come to her house when her husband was away, they could have talked over the fence. Maybe somehow a friend could give her the phone. But in any case, Sophia wouldn't refuse to take her in. Helen had no doubt about that. On Saturday morning, Helen looked at her husband, as if asking what their plans were for the day. "Unfortunately, I'm being called into work today," Leo said. "Getting my second cup of coffee. Do you remember what you promised me?" The young woman couldn't stand it. What did he pretend not to remember? But then he laughed. "Of course, I know how much you're looking forward to it. Let's go tomorrow right from the morning." It was rainy on Sunday, but Leo was not going to cancel the trip. First, he brought Helen to the country square. The rain had already stopped freezing, but there was not a single person in the alleys. The young woman was very disappointed at this circumstance. If she just tried to run away from Leo here, he would catch up with her in a few seconds, and there was no one to turn to for help. At this time, the husband received a phone call. "There is a slight change of plans," he told Helen. "I have to be in the office now, but..." It dragged on interminably. "You can go shopping by yourself. I'll give you the card, if you don't mind." Helen could only nod. "I'll give you 2 hours. I'll call a cab, then I'll wait for you at home." Leo sat his wife down himself, pulled up his car, and gave the address Center City, the very street that was considered the center of big and small stores. Helen watched in the small mirror as her husband's figure moved away. "Change of plans," she told the cab driver. "As soon as the car rounded the corner, I'll stop by a friend's house first." If only she had ended up at Sophia's, she would have nothing more to fear. Helen didn't regret not bringing her things with her. Didn't care. She would get a job and be able to provide herself and the baby with the essentials. The main thing was to get out of this captivity. The cab driver shrugged his shoulders, saying he didn't care where he was taking her. And after a quarter of an hour, he stopped the car near the house where Sophia lived. Helen awkwardly got out of the cab. She had lost the gracefulness of her movements since the onset of her pregnancy. She still had to climb to the 3rd floor, and her heart was racing like a hare's. There was a slight odor of Wendy's in the stairwell, and Helen was overcome with nostalgia. It had always smelled like this in here. Sophia's neighbor old lady, Wendy, had a great deal of respect for it, and put it generously in all the closets and commands. Helen pressed the bell button, imagining that in a few seconds her friend would open the door for her, and they would throw themselves around each other's necks. But no one rushed to open it. In vain, Helen called again and again with a falling heart. The young woman realized that her friend was not at home. She must have gone to the store somewhere. But she would wait for Sophia. There was no other way out. Helen lost the bag and sank down on the steps. When she heard the front door open, she was alarmed. It could have been Sophia. A few moments later, she couldn't believe her eyes. Leah was coming up the stairs. "How did you find me?" she asked, barely audibly. "Honey, it was a test, and you didn't pass it. I had no doubt you would escape, though." And of course, I had no trouble guessing where. There's nowhere else to go. If you were smart, you'd get in a cab and go to your father's. But you're a poor, naive fool. Don't call Sophia. She's on vacation in the South, and I'm sure she's perfectly happy and doesn't think about you. And you knew she was away. Helen asked with just her lips. Of course I knew. Otherwise, I wouldn't have offered you that walk. What kind of a bitch are you? Now let's go home, calmly, Leo continued. Not long before, Helen was contemplating when she would go into labor, whether it would be possible to keep from screaming, to shout in front of everyone. It seemed very embarrassing to her, but now she was exactly screaming help. Leo squeezed her hand tightly. You want me to call the psychiatric team? I have a friend who works there. He's aware of the problem and will come faster than the police. If you expect her to be called by the neighbors, a psychiatrist will tell the cops you have a diagnosis, and a caring husband will drive you. So I suggest you don't embarrass yourself and make yourself look crazy in front of a lot of other people. With her head down, Helen followed her husband. The tide of emotions was too strong. She felt sick, barely able to stand on her feet. Leo's car was parked in the driveway. He loaded his wife into the back seat like a thing in a mirror. Helen saw his grin. She closed her eyes and didn't open them the whole way. She really felt no longer a human being as a person as before, but an object, belonging to a master. Helen had become depressed. Not only did she not do household chores, but she would not leave her room, lying all day long, turning her back to the wall and keeping silent when she had to get up to go to the restroom. She felt herself weakening quickly, and it was a pleasant sensation. Helen wanted to sink into oblivion as soon as possible and leave this world that way. And the last thing she wanted was for Leo to disturb her and talk to her. The day came when he came and put a chair next to her bed and sat down. It won't go on like this, he said. If you don't eat, you won't last long. Helen twitched and, without turning around, made it clear that she didn't care. Now you're definitely mentally ill. Leo continued. And if you don't do something about it, you're not going to get better. Let me go, Helen said. Come with me. She got out of bed, listless, like a marionette. She no longer believed her husband. Leo held her hand tightly as they went down the stairs and then down another one to the basement. Helen wondered if she had the strength to make it upstairs. After all, and this was indifferent to her, what did it matter where she lay? Might as well be on the floor in the hall. In the basement, Leo opened the very door that was usually closed, for which his old things were kept, as he had said. Now Helen saw that the room was completely empty. A cage. Now her husband held Helen by both hands and spoke to her like a child. If you behave as you do now, I won't be able to leave you alone. You understand? In your condition, you could hurt yourself. There's plenty of opportunity for that up there in the house. And I can't let anything happen to you and the baby. You keep going. You'll be seen by a psychiatrist friend of mine, prescribed pills, and you'll live here with all the furniture. Mattress, night potty is fine. You had this torture chamber specially set up? She asked. No, I shrugged. It's not uncommon for mansions to have a secret room like this to hide in. If there's a break-in, a robbery, or some other emergency. This time it's my emergency. You're the one who wants to be medicated, so you'll lie there like a vegetable. Why do you need all this? Helen didn't realize she was going to ask that question herself. Neither did Leo expect it. He was silent for a few moments. Because you're mine, he finally said, when you and I got married, you're the only one I belong to. I've never thought of leaving you or changing you, but you're always tearing yourself apart. But I won't let you go. You promised, Leo. But 1 million people get divorced. Helen said tiredly, what makes you think our marriage is special? I think you're the one who's mentally ill, not me. Be that as it may, he replied, holding back his anger. Do you have to answer that question? Do you want to spend the time left before the birth in a human way? Or do you want to be locked up in here? Not humanly. It will be either way. Helen sighed. You know, I don't care. It's up to you. Okay, he said. We'll give you another chance. Well, have something to eat tonight. Let's go upstairs. And Leo helped his wife up the steps, overcome that she couldn't do it alone. Helen knew she had to wait for the birth. but she could not have imagined the shock that awaited her. The young woman had packed a bag in advance with things she might need at the hospital. If Leo wished to check on her, well, there were no secrets. Nightgowns, hygiene items, a few books. And yet, as Helen looked at that bag, it represented to her the hope that she would be able to get out of here soon. But when it was time to go to the hospital, Leo said, "Will you give birth at home, dear?" Helen looked up, and there was pain in her eyes, as if he had hit her again. "Yes, yes," her husband went on. "The doctor is on his way. What is it that you don't like? In the old days, only the poor gave birth in maternity hospitals, and the rich had midwives. It was the order of the day, so I've organized this luxury for you." "What kind of luxury is that?" Helen bit her lip in pain. "What about sterility? What if something goes wrong and you need an operation? There's no facilities at home. If there are problems, then we'll deal with them," Leo said nonchalantly. "You're young, healthy. Everything should go as it should." To be honest, Helen soon didn't care who her doctor was, whether sterility would be assured for the next few hours. She felt like she was dying. The pain was so intense that the paramedics who arrived had to give her anesthesia. Maybe they did it out of mercy? Or maybe Leo had insisted, not wanting his wife's screams to be heard on the street. Even though their house was on the edge of the woods, it was still the edge of the street. When Helen came to, she didn't immediately realize where she was. Nothing hurt. It was blissfully light. For a while, she thought she had returned to her childhood and was lying on her bed in her parents' house. Then her vision began to focus, and she saw a dark red that it took another effort to remember everything. Someone entered the room. Helen turned her head and saw Leo's face. His was as fearless and calm as ever, unbelievable. "Who was born?" Barely audible, she asked. "We have a baby girl." "Show her to me," Helen asked, and mentally added not at us, but at me. Then said Leo, "I want you to show her to me." Helen's old stubbornness was definitely back. After all, it was me who gave birth to her. "Now you get some sleep, and then I'll show her to you," Leo promised. Helen knew it was useless to ask, and she was in no condition to get up and leave to look for her daughter right now. She was very weak. As soon as she closed her eyes, she fell, either into sleep or unconsciousness. Leo did not deceive her when Helen woke up feeling better. Leo had brought her baby. Helen was afraid to hold her daughter in her arms, such a small, tiny newborn head. It required careful support. "Is she all right?" Helen asked, not noticing she was crying. She put her daughter to her breast. "What did the doctors say?" "The girl is healthy." "Let there be faith," Helen decided, gazing into the baby's face. She didn't need hope. It was something shaky and uncertain, driving happiness crazy. She needed a firm belief that they would both get out of this nightmare quest. Leo agreed nicely. There was no crib in the room, and as the newborn napped, Helen began to look around helplessly, where to put her. "Let me carry the baby to her room." Leo held out his arms. "I want her to live with me." Helen slowly. "Okay, tomorrow we'll move the crib in here and move everything around. But you need to sleep well tonight so you won't be woken up by baby cries. You need to rest. Don't you realize I can hear her from any room?" But still Helen gave her husband the baby. And he was right. Her strength was so exhausted that she slept soundly and dreamlessly that night. When she woke up in the morning, she realized she could try to get up. Leo brought her breakfast: coffee, toast, jam, eggs. "Bring it, Emily," demanded Helen. And noticing the strange expression on his face, she threatened him, "Or I'll definitely go on a hunger strike." "Emily no longer lives in this house," he said. "What?" Helen's heart literally stopped. "Don't be so scared. She's still doing fine. Only she will live somewhere else and other people will take care of her. And if you want to see her someday, you don't do anything stupid. That's the surest way to keep you in line," he added with a chuckle. Helen looked at him with horror. "Are you a human being?" she asked, shocked. "And who is?" Was there a grin on his face? "You're just a crazy sadist. I understand that you are excited. There have been so many changes in your life yet, but I still control my behavior and my words. Unless you want to spend the rest of your life in an insane asylum. That's where you won't be seen, Emily." Her husband bowed slightly and left. From that day on, personal hell began for Helen. After a tantrum so violent she could have died or gone mad. There was a breakdown in her character. It was like she lost her will. She became submissive like a dog that wants to earn its master's approval. She now lived day by day, fulfilling all his wishes, so that on the first of every month he threw on her lap another picture of Emily. Here is the baby learning to lift her head, to roll over, to sit up. Here she was taking her first timid steps, stepping along the couch. Helen tried to understand where her daughter was, based on the surroundings. But only a white wall was in the photographer's field of vision, and this very worn cherry-colored couch. And of course, the baby. Helen had no doubt that it was her daughter, even though she had only seen the little girl once. It was undoubtedly her. Helen recognized Emily's face as her own. Same nose shape, slit, and eye color. Except that the girl's hair was blonde, like Leo's. From the outside, it might have seemed that Helen's situation was now better. She began to leave the house invariably in the company of her husband. But still now the two of them were seen in cafes, stores, 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 and parks. But Helen saw this freedom as a humiliation. If before she had nurtured in herself hatred for her husband and considered him crazy, now she was forced to pretend to be a happy wife. Leo had warned her if she tried the antics he said she would never see the baby again. And Helen knew her husband was capable of carrying out his threat, even if she managed to get to the police. And Leo would be apprehended. He just wouldn't reveal the secret where the girl was. How long would this torture last? Helen asked herself longingly. Would it ever end? Would her husband abuse her? A year, 2, 3, or a lifetime? Her psyche was teetering on the brink. Helen was afraid that such a life would make her lose her mind. Now she was bound to Leo much more firmly than before by the word, and hoped to see her daughter someday. She and Leo got into the habit of stopping by the supermarket on Saturday nights and buying groceries for the week. One time, Helen was selecting an item in the dairy department, and Leo walked a little farther to pull a bottle of wine off the shelves. The unfamiliar young man quickly passed the young woman, but also dropped a carton of milk into her cart. Helen opened her mouth in surprise at first, then saw Sophia in the back of the store in the distance, making a hand sign to her. Everything was going as it should. Helen nodded involuntarily. They were not allowed to approach each other. Leo would stop it immediately, and there was no telling what Helen's punishment would be. Maybe he would lock her in the basement or beat her up again. He often raised his hand to her. Helen was used to enduring the pain. She didn't scream or cry now. She only flinched like a dog being kicked by a cruel master. When she and Leo arrived home, the first thing Helen did was look at the milk carton, and her pencil had written, "Your father is dying. No hope, calling to say goodbye." And then all the skills Helen had recently acquired went out the window. She rushed to her husband. "I have to go home," she begged. He raised his eyebrows. "Why? Is father dying? I haven't seen him in years. I can never forgive myself if I don't say goodbye to him. You're not the ultimate monster. Let me go for a few days and I'll be back. I swear to you, or let's go together." He grabbed her chin. "How do you know about your father? Tell me," she blurted it out. It was the first thing that popped into her head. "I met a friend at the store." She said, "Don't lie." He didn't believe it for a second. "First of all, you weren't talking to anyone there. Secondly, if someone had told you about your father, you'd have told me right away. And you only found out about it now. Someone handed you the phone, wrote you a note. Tell me." Helen didn't see any other choice but to lay it on the line, did she? Maybe then he'd take pity and let her go to her father. She showed him the ill-fated box. "I see," he squinted. "You're not going anywhere. Father can die just fine without you. Leo, for God's sake." Helen knelt in front of her husband. "You realize you'll do a terrible thing if you don't let me go. Fate can forgive a lot of things, but it punishes for such things. The boomerang will come and it'll be interesting to watch. His tone hasn't even changed. It was just as cold and mocking. And for being so eager to deceive me. Next month, there will be no pictures of you with Helen had a terrible tantrum in her memory. She sobbed for hours locked in her room. And when she did want to come out, she realized that Leo's intention was not to let her out anytime soon. She spent about a week alone. It was good that the bedroom was connected to the bathroom. At least Helen was not thirsty. Her husband didn't bring her any food. It was a real prison. There were bars on the windows to keep out burglars. The view was of a high fence with a forest beyond. Helen didn't know when she would be released, but when Leo got the call to report that her father had died, her husband purposely came to the door so she could hear his voice. Leo expressed his condolences and said that unfortunately he and Helen could not make it to the funeral. Very busy with work. Well, as soon as they have a moment to spare, they'll come and look at it. It seemed like a week. Helen felt that her mind was tormented, and she could not tell exactly how many days had passed when Leo opened the door, could go downstairs and eat something. After that, Helen finally broke down. She became apolitical and indifferent to everything. She didn't care whether she stayed at home or followed her husband, and wherever he led her, keeping her head down. She did her homework, but she did it thorough as an automaton. When the housework was finished, she would sit or lie motionless, looking at one point. You couldn't tell whether she was immersed in her thoughts or in prostration. When Leo spoke to her, she answered him, but she answered the question. It was impossible to get a word out of her now. The question remained, why would he want such a broken doll? But it was as if he was satisfied that he had brought her to such a state that she walked like a mannequin without feelings, thoughts, and desires. That he had complete power over her. Something human appeared in Helen's gaze only when her husband placed another photograph of his daughter in front of her. She would stare at her for a long time, and the expression in her eyes would become sad, as if she were mentally talking to Emily. Then she put the pictures in the album and put it in someone's drawer. She knew that if she kept pulling out and looking at the pictures, Leo would throw the album away. Just like he destroyed everything she cared about, so she would pick up the album once a month just to put another picture in it. And so the years went by. One day, in a conversation between the couple, the number 18 came up. When Emily turns 18, I'll tell you. And then she'll decide for herself if she wants to see you. And if she does, I won't object. Helen decided to think of this day as the tipping point of her imprisonment, after which she would either have her freedom and her daughter, or she would be gone. Now she knew that it was possible not to make any effort for this not to take any sin on her soul. She would leave simply out of longing and despair. In the last month before that date, she knitted a beautiful blue shawl. It had once been her favorite color, and she hoped her daughter would like it. On the cherished day, she gave Leo the shawl package, asking him to give it to Emily for me. He grinned, but took the package. That day, he didn't come home for a long time. Helen had no doubt that he had gone to Faith. After all, she is his daughter after all, and celebrating her coming of age. When she heard the house gate open in the evening, she ran downstairs. Well, she asked. He could have taunted her by demanding, for example, that she serve him dinner first. But Leo would not do that. He handed her the package. Emily doesn't want to know you. Why not? Helen whispered with just her lips. Did you tell her what you did to me? And I told her you left her. And now you're sorry and you want to make amends. I never said a word to her about you before. Helen herself did not expect what would happen. Then she threw herself at her husband, forgetting everything. She beat him with her fists ineptly and desperately, and screamed like a man who had been hurt intolerably and painfully. Leo was so unaware of this that after only a few seconds he came to his senses, and twisted his wife, and dragged her down to the basement. Helen was lying on the floor. It was very difficult for her to move. She didn't even want to raise her head, not even to turn it. The only thing the woman wanted was for everything to end here and now. She knew that Leo had locked the door from the outside. Or rather, there was an English lock. Her husband pushed her inside and slammed the door shut. Sooner or later he would open it or he wouldn't. It was all the same. When Helen tried to pull herself up, Her head fell helplessly to the floor, and her broken nose bled again. But Leo had never beaten her to the point of mutilating her. One has to think now, too. Nothing was fixable. It hadn't happened. Just a cruel lesson. After a while, she'd be able to walk again like she used to. But things happened differently than Helen had envisioned. When the door swung open and Leo saw his wife, he even apparently thought he had overdone it. He walked over to her and bent over. Later, Helen felt as if it was not she who had acted, but some force. Instead, she tore at her husband's leg, in a sudden, sharp movement. And when he lost his balance for a few moments, she jumped up and dashed for the door. Only when the lock clicked behind her back, her tormentor still inside, did she catch her breath. Helen heard her husband banging on the door and shouting something. But she also knew that the door was tight and secure. Not something even a man could just kick down. Nevertheless, she couldn't allow herself to gather herself quietly. Acting quickly, she frantically changed into jeans and a thin sweater. She threw on a jacket, shoved a few changes of underwear and the essentials into her bag. She knew where the money and her husband's card were. She didn't need to cover her tracks. On the contrary, she wanted Leo to be punished. The money, the files. Everything seemed to be in place. An ordered cab pulled up. Helen gave her friend's address. If she wasn't at home, she should go to the hospital. We weren't home. She aghast when she saw Helen with her bat on the doorstep. The friends hugged and cried, and could not unclasp the embrace. Then Sophia oiled the abrasions. Helen applied ice to the biggest bruise. She made a sandwich and a cup of strong coffee. She wanted to pour brandy, but Helen stopped her. No, don't. First, you have to go to the hospital to get the bruises removed, and then to the police. That's what the friends did. Sophia didn't leave Helen alone. She held her hand. Helen felt like Leo was about to appear behind her, calling out to her. Right on top of him, she heard his voice and picked herself up time after time. Again, there was no way for him to get out of the secret room by himself. Helen had finished telling her story to Alex, and now sat looking at the sea. What happened next? He asked, silently. Next, the police came to Leo's house. He was released from his confinement and immediately detained. There was a trial. He got less time than I expected, only 2 years. That is, he was given more, but released after 2 years. When I found out about it, I immediately left town to come here. I'll have to go back soon. How have you been living all this time? Turns out my father left me a nice inheritance. And I also found out that Leo had deposited a large sum of money into my account. Some money was no problem. That's good, because I couldn't work for a while. I was in treatment. I was very close to losing my mind. Maybe that's why they gave Leo a little bit of a pass. They thought I was crazy and that I was talking about him a lot. The beatings really couldn't be hidden. And your daughter? My ex-husband never said where she was. Not with the police, not in court. Helen shook her head, so I don't know anything. Wasn't he charged with kidnapping? He made it look like there was no baby, Helen said. There wasn't. And it's all in my sick imagination. It's a miracle that thanks to the testimony of Sophia and other people I know, it was possible to prove that he deprived me of my freedom. Why was he released so early? Alex was trying to figure it out. It doesn't make sense. I bought an apartment, said Helen. I had to have somewhere to live. But now I don't know how I'm going to get back. He'll be walking the streets of the same city. He won't leave me alone. I think he's got some kind of obsession with me. Don't you want to move? Asked Alex, to another city. Start from scratch again. A naked man on bare ground. I don't have the strength for that. My father died with my stepmother and my siblings. I don't keep in touch. I only have a few girlfriends, and now I will be forced to leave them. But when I found out he was released, I became panicky, afraid to come home, to go into an empty apartment. I feel like they're waiting for me there, waiting for the door to open, for him to come out. When do you have to go back? Asked Alex. In 3 days, answered Helen. Alex's decision to move in with Helen was met by the young man's parents in a flurry. I didn't think I would live to see this, said the mother, making me remember scenes from novels. You realize that after this, no one will respect you. Getting involved with a woman 20 years older than you. Mom, how many times have I told you I'm not having an affair with Helen? Alex wasn't so hot-headed anymore. He said those words in a tired tone. She just needs help right now. Who are you trying to fool? She's a rich woman. She can hire any help she wants, not ask a student who has no extra time. We have to learn. Even if we believed you, no one will. You be labeled as someone who can be bought. And no decent girl. Maybe it's my problem finding girls. Alex was starting to get hot. You've already found one, my mother parried. That lady should retire soon. I understand her desire to find a young boy. Alex was packing his things, trying to control himself. Stop it. Father turned to his mother. You are going to agree that Alex will not come to us. Do you understand him? Yes, man to man, Mother couldn't calm down. This Helen is my age. Let me get another student instead of you. What would you say then? The father switched to his son. If you don't want to live with us, maybe just rent an apartment. We'll help you pay for it. A lot of guys your age are living with girls. Why do you have such a strange choice? Are you going to drop out? Alex was already standing in the doorway. I'll drop out if everyone needs me while I'm in. He found it easier to breathe outside. Helen lived in a new house in the heart of the city. It overlooked a square. You could admire the fountains. Sitting on the loggia with a cup of coffee. Alex, the university was a short walk from here. Walking distance. He could be grateful to Helen for a separate room with its own balcony and all the furnishings of his dwelling. Not at all comparable to his parents' modest apartment. But he could see that she needed him more than she was letting on about it. Helen stayed out of his life completely, but she cared. Alex took a sabbatical and got a job. In the morning, when he was about to leave, she would make him coffee and make him something to eat, even though he asked her not to worry and not to get up so early. She would sit against him in the kitchen, watching him eat and smiling slightly. If he didn't speak himself, she was silent with her. But it was surprisingly easy to keep silent with Helen, as if we were on the same wavelength. He came rather late. When the fall came, it was already beginning to get dark. And again, they would sit together at the table. And there was Helen's incomparable coffee in small cups. And Alex more words from the left in the evening, often humorously told about how his day went. There was nothing to tell about Helen, except about books read and movies watched. But Alex noticed that she became calmer around him. Her face rounded a little. She lost her painful thinness. Her hair began to grow. Helen went to the hairdresser, made a hairstyle that suited her more than before. She even found a hobby. She started growing flowers. By the time she became a winter girl, the apartment was like a winter garden. I guess it was the earth that had drawn her to the land as she got older. Helen shrugged his shoulders. Returning, Alex often saw such a picture. Helen sits in an armchair, as if in a green thunderstorm of branches beating all over. Softly speaking sconces, and the woman is reading a book. Alex involuntarily noted that the woman remained beautiful, despite all that she had been through. If I ever get married, I would like such a mother-in-law, he thought, feeling that Helen gradually becomes for him a native person. But sometimes, when he woke up in the middle of the night, he saw a light in the kitchen. And that means that Helen again had a terrible dream, in which the door quietly opens and her ex-husband enters. And now until morning, she will sit, drink coffee, and listen. Would there be footsteps on the stairs? She realized that these were far-fetched fears, but she couldn't help it. From Leo's house, Helen had taken nothing with her except her personal belongings, a photo album, and a blue shawl she had knitted for her daughter. The shawl now hung in her room. Alex did not hide from her that he was trying to find her husband and daughter. But he didn't tell her the details. And when the young man disappeared for days at a time, Helen knew it had something to do with the search, but she never questioned it. It was too painful and intolerable for her to hope and then be disappointed. And so the year passed. Helen wanted to talk to Alex about his plans for the summer. She herself wanted to go somewhere to the north, maybe to Karelia. She couldn't stand the heat, and she thought if the young man wanted to, he could accompany her. If he has a girlfriend, let him take her with him. She's paying for the young people's room. Alex's presence gave her a semblance of family, but she didn't have time to talk about it. The day came when Alex knocked on her room. "I need to talk to you." Helen looked up with frightened eyes. "Did you find out something bad?" "Leo found me. We have to leave. Will you let me sit down?" Settled across from Helen in the chair, Alex began to speak. "I found out why your ex-husband was released. Of course, not only in connection with it, but this circumstance also played a big role. Leo went blind." As Helen asked in a whisper. "There, when he was serving time, there was a fight in the zone. He got beat up pretty bad. Concussion and blindness. He was in the hospital for a long time, and he'll never see again. The doctors are sure he won't. But I wondered what he was. Why did he treat you like that? Because by the time you were married, he was already a wealthy, well-to-do man. And Emily, did you find out anything about Emily?" Helen interrupted. "Wait a minute. I was sure this behavior was more typical of someone from a marginalized background. But when I delved into all of this, he really had a rough childhood. After his father left, the family lived in blatant poverty. An old house, and there wasn't even heating with a stove and wood. The mother, whom Leo loved very much, began to drink first and then reached for other men. She would leave the house and spend the night somewhere. And the boy was left alone in the fuel rooms, sleeping in his jacket when she returned drunk, and often with some lonely woman bragging to her son about a new ring and a new dress. Leo asked Mom, "Why did you leave me for someone else? You have your whole life ahead of you." She said, "Mine is passing, and you can't give me anything right now, so don't judge me for taking from others." Maybe that's what gave him the incentive to get ahead at all costs and become a wealthy man. It was an attempt to prove something to his mother, but it failed. When Leo started earning well, his mother was already dead. A life of excess is no good. And when he met you, all his childhood complexes were realized. His mother didn't belong to him. She was always slipping away from him, swapping him for someone else. So he decided to make you all his, at any cost. At first, he thought you'd be his child. But then he realized you could leave with a baby in your arms. That's when he separated you and your daughter. He knew there was no better blackmail than a daughter. He may or may not give her back to you, and as long as he has the daughter, you'll be at his mercy. Then why did he take my hope away? He said Emily didn't want to hear from me. Alex shrugged. Maybe he was tired of playing this game for so many years. Maybe he just snapped. But he wasn't going to let you go for sure. In your face, he was definitely avenging his mother for his childhood. Where he hid his faith. That's what tormented Helen. Most of all, she's alive. He gave her to strangers to be adopted. Do you know anything about that? I know. Alex was silent for a few moments, and the woman held her breath. You have no idea who raised her. Who did? Your stepmother. He brought her the little girl and assured her that you had given her up. He's too busy with work to raise a girl. Maria really did love your father. Her own sons were grown, and she realized she couldn't give the professor's own granddaughter to an orphanage. So she raised Emily. Leo visited the girl, took pictures. Helen held her hand to her throat. She really hates me and doesn't want to know. She's at Maria's now. Come with me. Alex suggested it. I have something to show you. And I also want you to know this. I met with Vera and talked to her. Helen had long ago given the young man the keys to her car, and now the car was waiting for them at the entrance. From excitement, the woman did not realize where they were going. The city ended, the villages went on. Then the road turned into the forest. Finally, Alex stopped the car and shocked. Helen recognized the place where she and her husband had once spent their honeymoon. The cottage by the lake. It had recently rained and the air was filled with the smell of pine needles, earth, and leaves. There was a small pier next to the cottages. It was empty now. It seemed that there was not a single living soul here, but it only seemed so. Helen did not immediately see on the landing in front of the cottages in a chair sat a man from the worst with gray hair and dark glasses. Helen would not have recognized Leo, but reason told her that it was him. And standing next to him, leaning toward him, was a girl. She was saying something to the old man, stroking his arm. Then the girl threw her head down. She was as fair-haired as her mother. And with her noble features, she resembled her grandfather. For a minute, she and Helen looked back at each other. Helen wanted to walk toward Faith, but realized she couldn't move. Her legs were failing. Alex, apparently sensing her condition, took her firmly under the elbow. "You are not angry that I decided to treat a little?" he asked quietly. Helen did not immediately realize what he was talking about. Emily said something to her father and slowly walked towards them. The closer the girl came, the more Helen's doubts grew. No tests were needed here, no questions asked. This was her baby girl, the one she had given birth to and held in her arms only once in her life. About 10 paces away, Emily stopped. And only now Helen noticed that on the girl's shoulders lay a blue fishnet bundle. The handkerchief was the same one that had hung in Helen's room a while ago, and looking at which she believed that she would give it to her daughter someday.